seriously considering it. Changing the subject, Kate asked him where he'd been, and Rutledge replied that he'd come from the yard. But Jean pressed him, as if to prove that his every move as a policeman was fascinating to her. "I was briefly in Kent, Tunbridge in fact," he added lightly, "conferring with a colleague." He turned to Lucy, attempting to draw her into general conversation. But a few minutes later, she set down her cup and said, "You'll be looking forward to your dinner and a quiet evening." Rising, she took her leave of the others, and he accompanied her to the door, asking if he could find a cab for her. "As it happens, I'm just in the next street, staying with friends. It was good to see you again, Ian. If this isn't what you need, you have only to send word to the cottage." "I must tell you this information comes at a good time." He lowered his voice so that it didn't carry beyond the two of them. "You've read it. Do you see a connection with the vandalized gravestones?" "I didn't tell the vicar. I didn't think you wished it to become general knowledge until you'd seen what I'd discovered. However, I did walk in the churchyard. I couldn't read the names on the damaged stones, of course, but I could piece together who these men were by looking at the graves next to them in the family plots. And there they were, in one of the reports about the trial. It seems to validate what you suspected." He smiled. "You would make a great detective." "But I am," she replied, returning the smile. "It's what I do, hunting for clues to the past." "I've paid my sixpence," he reminded her. "I expect a copy of the visitor's guide." "You'll have to wait a bit longer then. I hope you'll allow me to use what you've discovered if it can be made public." He made no promises, reminding her instead, "You'll have fresher village information very shortly, if this war lasts any time. There will be heroes the villagers will want to remember." She looked away. "The war has claimed its first victim in Beecham. 4 friends went to enlist. One was turned down, something to do with his eyes. He went home and hanged himself." Good God! It was all he could think to say. Lucy took a deep breath. "Good luck finding your man. Anyone could have bought a newspaper during that trial and learned the same information I've copied for you. It was public knowledge then." He thanked her and watched her as far as the corner before shutting the door and returning to the sitting room. Jean said, "What were you two whispering about?" "A tragedy. You don't want to know. It would distress you." "I didn't realize you knew Lucy Muir," she added archly. "I met her in the course of an inquiry. She was able to provide information that was critical." Kate said, rising, "I'm awash in tea, Jean, and I have an engagement for dinner. Are you leaving?" Jean smiled up at Rutledge. "Unless you can be persuaded to take us to dinner." "My dear, I have to finish a report for the yard," he told her. It was his first intentional lie to her, but his mind was on the contents of the envelope lying beside the teapot. They were urgent, and difficult to explain without going into details that would trouble Jean, her cousin, and Francis. Kate touched Jean's arm. "Your mother will be wondering where you are." Francis, ringing the bell for the housekeeper, didn't press them to stay. Rutledge asked, "Shall I drive you home?" It was the least he could do. "Would you, Ian?" Jean asked. It was well over an hour later when Rutledge came back to the sitting room. "They're safely home, and the motorcar put away." "She wouldn't leave, Ian. Not after Miss Muir arrived. Kate did her best." "Are you all right?" he asked, looking more closely at her. "It's just this war. Everyone seems to be so thrilled. so in a hurry to fight. I've had what felt like an endless stream of visitors calling to say goodbye. It's terribly depressing." He said, "Men at the yard have been resigning, intending to enlist. I expect it's just the beginning." She roused herself. "You've been away a great deal of late. Jean has been complaining. I think Lucy was the last straw. Was it just to Tunbridge?" "Today, yes, although I think I've driven over half of England in the past month." He didn't tell her that it was Fillmore Gilbert who had almost died. He knew it would distress her, as would his encounter with Dobson. He said, "Would you care to dine out? I owe you an evening pleasanter than your afternoon." He tried not to look in the direction of the envelope. Shaking her head, she said, "Thank you, but no. We'll only be told about a dozen more friends who've gone mad with war fever. There's a roast from last night, I think. We will dine well enough here." And then what was troubling her came out in a rush. "Jean says you're trying to wind up all your cases so that you'll be free to fight, like all the rest. That's why you've been away so much of late. Is that why Miss Muir brought you that envelope? To hasten the conclusion to whatever it is you're working on at the moment?" He laughed, though he didn't feel like it. It wouldn't do for Jean's fiancé to appear to be less patriotic than her father. After a moment, he added more seriously, "I've found satisfaction in what I do as a policeman. The British Army is made up of men who feel the same way about protecting their country and its interests. Thank God for it. They have their duty as I have mine. I don't need to prove my courage, Francis. I've seen people die, and it's not pleasant." It was the first time he'd let her hear the darker side of his work. She looked away. And then she went on as if goaded by her worry. "But what if it's a longer war than we think it will be? Or we start to lose Ian, like Belgium? They can't possibly stand up to the German army. What if we can't? If France can't?" "Then I shall have to reconsider. I shouldn't worry if I were you. It's not likely to happen." He realized suddenly that her concern might not be only for him. He said in a different voice, "Francis, is there someone you care for?" She turned back to face him, saying brightly, "No, no, of course not." Just then the housekeeper came to ask when they wished to have their dinner, and he wasn't able to judge whether his sister was lying or not. It wasn't until much later that he was free to go up to his room and look at the contents of the envelope that Lucy Muir had left for him. He whistled under his breath as he realized just how much work she must have done on his behalf. Unable to obtain copies of the newspaper columns, just as she'd said, she had written it all out in longhand. There was word here or there that he'd had trouble making out, but the substance of all the pages spread out on his desk was clear. Evan Dobson had been desperate to recoup his losses on the bridle. It was a substantial sum for a poor man, and realizing that he would be out of pocket for the lot, even though he'd delivered the bridle as promised, he'd turned to the father when the son proved to be a scoundrel. Whether Dobson had killed the greengrocer or simply taken his fists to him in frustrated anger, leaving the son to finish what he'd begun, was hard to say. But the son had sworn that he hadn't touched his father, and he was believed. Patricide was an unthinkable crime. The jury had heard the evidence and found Dobson guilty, and Atkins's son had walked away without paying for the bridle, inheriting his father's property as well. What had become of the younger Atkins? He turned to Lucy Muir's list, but there was no mention of his name there after the trial. The names of the jury seemed to leap off the closely written sheets of paper. Hadley, Stoddard, Clayton, Tattersall. All of whom must have put the trial behind them and moved on. But not so the Dobsons. They'd never really recovered. And Fillmore Gilbert, who no longer remembered it, who thought someone else must have been given that brief, had acted for the Crown. Rutledge looked for the name of the judge, and found it. A man named Vernon Abner, who, given his age at the time, must have died long since. Somehow Lucy Muir had even discovered that bit of information in the obituaries. He silently blessed her again. Abner had died at age 68 of a digestive disorder. His wife and only son had predeceased him, and he'd been buried beside them in one of the fashionable London cemeteries. Lucy had ticked off the names of the jurors whose graves had been vandalized, with a footnote to that effect. 11 men accounted for. That left one man still in danger. Someone by the name of Chaston. Tomorrow he'd ask Sergeant Gibson to find him so that he could be warned. No, there was one more. The policeman who had come to the Dobson house and taken away Henry Dobson's father, Taylor. Sergeant Ralph Taylor. Rutledge sat back. It was all there. Everything he needed to prove his case. One man had done it all. The vandalizing, the murders, the attempted murder of Gilbert. That was one short week among so many as the years had passed, but it had cast its shadow over the lives of more than a dozen people. But what was it Dobson had held over the heads of the 4 men who had willingly drunk their milk, knowing it would kill them? What had his mother told him that he'd remembered and used as an excuse to kill? Even Lucy Muir hadn't been able to find an answer to that. The graves had come first, and then the murders. Appetite whetted, or had it just taken a little longer to find his victims? Rutledge was up early the next morning, driving out to the London cemetery, where, according to his obituary, Judge Abner had been interred.
This is the end of the disc. The audiobook continues on the next disc.
It wasn't a necessary visit, but he was curious to see if the black substance had been poured out there as well. There was a morning fog lying heavily over the Thames Valley, giving the landscape a featureless sameness that twice nearly made him miss his turn. But he found the cemetery, opened the unlocked gates, and let himself through. He found himself thinking that it was a good thing he didn't believe in ghosts. The funeral monuments here were far more ornate than those found in most village churchyards. Tall plinths bearing urns draped in marble shrouds loomed over his head. Angels with outspread wings seemed in the murky light about to take flight, and grieving figures reaching toward tombs had about them a Gothic air. Mausoleums designed like miniature houses or Greek temples seemed to shut him into the narrow avenues that led between plots of graves. He made a mental note at each intersection which direction he'd come from, uncertain if he could find his way out again. And the mist was getting heavier. He had no idea where he might find Abner's grave, and at this early hour there was no one else about. The man had died some 15 years ago, and so Rutledge searched for an older section. A pair of doves, asleep in the lee of a stone bench, flew up almost at his feet, and he started before he could stop himself, then smiled. What had he thought they were? The spirits of the dead? 2 more turnings, and then at the corner of the next intersection he saw it. The monument to the man who had sent Evan Dobson to the gallows. At first it appeared to be part of the design of the monument. A rough-hewn marble obelisk broken off at a little less than mid-shaft, as in a life cut off before its time. But as he drew nearer, He could see that it hadn't been rough-hewn at all. Someone had taken a heavy hammer to it in a frenzy, smartly bringing down what must originally have been quite a tall shaft, then striking it again and again until the splintered shards lay like pebbles at its base. Abner's name was still visible, as if that was intended. All around it was desolation. The smaller stones for his wife and son, his father and his mother, hadn't been spared. It appeared that the frenzy hadn't stopped until the marble had been utterly destroyed. Whoever had done this wished he could reach into the grave itself and grind the very bones to powder. Chapter 17. Rutledge made his way out of the mist-shrouded cemetery, still feeling the shock of what he'd seen. It was obscene in its way, a glimpse into a fury so violent that whoever had done this must have been spent when he had finished. The destruction had never been reported to the yard. Rutledge was fairly certain of that. The groundskeepers must have notified the cemetery authorities, who could well have contacted the family or heirs of the dead man, but nothing had come of it yet. He didn't even know when this had been done. After the other graves had been vandalized, but before Benjamin Clayton had been killed. Or was this destruction what had sent Dobson to Moresby to begin killing anyone from that fateful trial who was still alive? Rutledge found a caretaker just arriving for his day's work. Dressed in coveralls and pushing a barrow, he was whistling to himself as he approached the tall cemetery gates. He started when he saw a figure looming out of the grey wall of mist that nearly obscured them. Setting down the barrow, he waited until Rutledge came closer, a man and not a spirit, then said, "You could age a man fast coming at him like that out of thin air. Looking for a family grave, are you?" "There's a damaged stone in the eastern part of the cemetery, someone by the name of Abner. How long has it been that way?" The workman tilted his cap forward and scratched his balding head. "That obelisk pounded into rubble. Seems it was about the first week of July. One of the lads found it. We searched the cemetery, but there wasn't no other trouble. Whoever he was, he'd gone. One of the sheds was broken into, but nothing was taken." "Was there a heavy hammer in the shed?" "Aye, the big one we used to drive in stakes. But he never took it." "But he'd used it. Dobson couldn't have carried a tool like that with him. Not all the way from Somerset." Rutledge thanked him and went on to where he'd left the motor car. He wished he could bring the chief superintendent here to show him what they were dealing with. Not a twisted mind, but a passionate one that could take at least 4 murders in stride as deaths owed to him. For a moment he wondered if the polite young man witnesses had described was one and the same as this angry slayer. There would be no way to answer that until Henry Dobson was brought in for questioning. He drove on into the city and to the yard. Chief Superintendent Bowles, he was told by the first person he encountered, was attending a function with the Lord Mayor. The averted eyes of the constable he'd stopped left Rutledge with the feeling that the raised voices from Bowles's office the day before had raised more than a few eyebrows among those within hearing. Cummins, however, was in, and Rutledge asked him for a few minutes. As the chief inspector shut the door, he grinned. "I gather you have survived the dressing down, although a little singed round the edges." "Unfortunately, it was a day premature," Rutledge answered ruefully. "Last evening I was given more pieces of our puzzle. Today there was another." He told Cummins first about what he'd learned about the killer's way of discovering the information he needed about each victim. "I suspect his mother had intended at some stage to take matters into her own hands, but she'd never been free to carry out whatever she'd had in mind. Or perhaps she expected her son to act for her one day. It's the only explanation for keeping in touch with the jurors and Gilbert over the years. I have even wondered if perhaps she'd hastened any of the dead to their graves. But we'll never know the answer to that. Go on. Moving on to Fillmore Gilbert and spotting the man on the bicycle from the upstairs window of Swan Walk, Rutledge said, I wanted to ask the chief superintendent to send a description to every police station in Kent to be on the lookout for this man. But he wouldn't even consider the possibility, much less act on it. He took a deep breath. Then, last night, I was given this. It's a handwritten copy of Bristol newspaper accounts of the Dobson case and trial. Very thorough work, Cummins commented as he read it through. All the names are there, including Gilbert's, and the judge's name as well. He glanced out the window. The mist was lifting, and in an hour or so it would be replaced by bright sunlight. I went to the cemetery this morning to look for him. Cummins listened appalled as Rutledge described the gravesite. Gentle God, he said softly. I expect we can ask the cemetery authorities for a statement on when the destruction was done and what they think they know about it. I'll send Gibson or someone out there this afternoon. Not Gibson. I need him. There are 2 names left on the list of victims. A man named Chaston. And a policeman, most likely retired, by the name of Ralph Taylor, the arresting officer. We must find both of them as soon as possible. Still, it's just as well to document what happened in the cemetery. I can tell you, in the mist, it seemed to take on a horror that it might not have had on a sunny morning. No doubt. Cummins studied the man across his desk. This is a damning piece of evidence, Ian. The newspaper cutting. It all hangs together just as you predicted. The question is, how are we going to find this man and take him into custody? Will he come peacefully, do you think? Or will he make us pay dearly for it? I can't answer that. I can only say if we don't find him quickly, we might never put our hands on him. If I were in his shoes, as soon as I'd finished the last name on my list, I'd enlist. Under my own name or another, it wouldn't matter. I'd be out of reach. I have a feeling you may be right. If so, he's the only man in England that this war is bringing any good to. We've had more resignations tendered. For the duration. Most of them tell me they'll be back before the year is out. I pray to God they're right. I must return to Kent as soon as may be. I was ordered to see that inquiry through, and I can interpret that to mean I now have freedom to hunt for Dobson. And I've got to make Gilbert talk to me. I know everything now, except why these men willingly died. Who defended Evan Dobson? Now that's one of the interesting discoveries. It appears to be the father of the man who handled Joel Tattersall's trust. Simmons, the solicitor. Someone broke into his chambers in Wells fairly recently, but nothing was taken. I expect Dobson might have been looking for the file on his own father. How did Mrs. Dobson afford a barrister from Wells? Cummins asked. I don't know. It will be worth looking into. Leave Taylor and Chaston to me. I'll see they're located straight away and send word to you as soon as I have the information. Your task until then is to locate Dobson. Do you think he's still hanging about Swan Walk? I doubt it. I'm sure I put the wind up him when I followed him into Leicester Square, there by Penshurst Place. He must know who I am by this time. The village of Swan Walk does. But then, I know who he is. Be careful, Ian. What about the chief superintendent? He ordered you to go to Kent. I'd go if I were you. Rutledge grinned. Yes, sir. He packed a valise, sent messages to Jean and left another for Frances, who was attending one of her meetings with volunteers. Dr. Greening had just left when Rutledge arrived at Gilbert's house later in the afternoon. The nurse shook her head when he asked if there had been any change. "I'm afraid not. I think he's asleep just now." She hesitated. "It might be time to summon his family." "A day or two more won't matter." He asked Mrs. Thompson if she could prepare a room for him. "It will be ready when you are, sir." "Is there any change in Mr. Gilbert?" "I'm afraid not," he said, unconsciously quoting the nurse. "Is there a firearm in the house? A revolver?" "There is, in the estate office. I haven't seen it, but I'm told it's locked in one of the desk drawers." "Then, if you will, leave the key in my room." Soon after that, he went back to Penshurst Place. But there was no bicycle propped against the arch, and of course, no one in the church. He hadn't expected there to be. When he came back to Swan Walk, he drove his motor car around to the rear of the house and found a space large enough for it in one of the barns, to the dismay of the horses. Coming back around, he collected the constable's bicycle still leaning against the house wall by the door and stowed that in the barn as well. He took his dinner in his room and waited there until the house was quiet. It was close on 10 when he walked down the passage and spoke to the constable on duty. The man yawned. "They've made up a bed for me as well," he said. "I sleep during the day, when the servants are up and moving about, and return to my post in the evening, if that's all right." "Yes, good man. It's the night I'm worried about." "In what way, sir?" "It wasn't suicide. Whoever tried to kill Mr. Gilbert came into this house late at night and found him still awake. I don't think he'll risk coming when the staff is going about their duties. But the servants' rooms are well away from the rest of the house." "Understood, sir." He lifted the heavy truncheon beside his chair. "I'll be ready." Rutledge walked through the rooms of the ground floor, checking to see that the windows and outer doors were well and truly locked. Satisfied, he went back to the study where he'd met Gilbert on his first visit. Without turning on the lamp, he set about his preparations. He took a cigar from the humidor, but before sitting down in the chair that faced the long windows, he unlocked and opened them wide. As he stood there a moment, he could hear a frog calling from a pond. He poured himself a small glass of Gilbert's favourite brandy and put it on the table by the arm of the chair. In a dressing gown that was too big for him, wrapped in shawls and slumped in the chair, he tried to shrink into himself enough that he might pass as Gilbert sitting there. The masquerade wouldn't have passed muster with the lamp on, but in the dark he hoped that it would appear to be natural enough. It was a risk, waiting here when the danger could very well be upstairs. But he thought on the whole, with the constable and a nurse guarding him, Gilbert was safe enough. And he had Gilbert's revolver now. He cut and lit the cigar, drawing on it until he could see the glowing tip. He held it between 2 fingers, keeping an eye on it. An hour must have passed, and then 2. The house was quiet, settling around him with the sounds of the day's heat cooling off a little. A fox barked somewhere in the dark, and he refreshed the tip of the cigar for the 10th time. Rutledge had never been a smoker, but Gilbert was, and very likely he did most of it when there was no one about to tell him he couldn't. It must have been easy for Dobson, here and at Hadley's farm, Rutledge thought, with windows open to catch the coolness of the night after a long hot day. He could have watched his victim for some time before stepping in and confronting him. It had been easy as well at the Tattersall house, using the unlocked kitchen door for access. Just as another half an hour had ticked by, There was a sound. Barely on the threshold of Rutledge's hearing, keen as it was, and he tensed. The revolver was by his right hand under the blanket, and he closed his fingertips around the grip. Footsteps on the grassy lawn, or in the drying beds of delphiniums by the terrace. Or had he imagined it because he'd been listening so long for it? He could feel the hair on his arms stir as he waited. Something was out there. Or someone. Lifting the cigar to his lips again, he made the tip flare out. It cut into his night vision, but he could still judge that the terrace was empty. He stared out into the light, and someone stared back at him. Minutes passed. And then, as surely as the presence had come, it began to fade away. Going the opposite way around the house, looking for the motor car out of sight in the barn. Flinging off the scarves and shawls, dropping the cigar into the ashtray, Rutledge was through the windows and after him. But Dobson moved in the night with the swiftness and certainty of someone who knew the terrain, and Rutledge was hard-pressed to keep him in sight as he used every bit of shadow he could find. Along the west side of the house, Rutledge began to gain ground. He saw his quarry turn the corner closest to the drive. There was a soft clink, and Rutledge heard the pedals of a bicycle begin to turn. He ran flat out, narrowed the gap, snatched at the handlebars, almost had his man, and then felt rather than saw the foot lash out at him. It caught him on the flat of his knee, and he was forced to let go as pain shot through his leg. Dobson had reached the harder earth of the drive now, beginning to make better time. Through the shadows of the trees, Rutledge could see that the gate stood open. A matter of seconds and the man would be out of range. It would be too late. Rutledge still held the revolver. He swung it up, took careful aim, and fired. The bicycle jiggled wildly, then steadied. Rutledge whirled and raced toward the barn and his motor car. But he never found the cyclist again. As soon as it was light enough to see, Rutledge went inch by inch down the drive to the spot where he'd seen the bicycle wobble and searched for blood. He found it, large drops that led almost to the gates of Swan Walk. And there they stopped. He'd hit his mark in the night as the bicycle moved toward the uncertain patchy shadows beneath the trees that lined the drive. But just how badly was the man hurt? It was impossible to tell whether the wound had simply clotted or Dobson had managed to wrap something around it before he betrayed which way he'd turned. Rutledge searched the dusty road for 50 yards in either direction, without any luck. Lights had gone on in the servants' bedrooms at the sound of the shot, and the constable had come running, flinging open the house door, his truncheon at the ready. Rutledge had waved him back into the house as the motor car sped down the drive. The study doors still stood wide, and Gilbert was still in danger. But there had been no further excitement. Over breakfast, the constable had asked question after question preparing his report, but Rutledge had had to shake his head in answer to most of them. "No, I didn't expect him to come. I did hope that he would. No, I never saw his face. I fired in the hope of stopping him. No, it's not my revolver, it belongs to Mr. Gilbert. I tried to follow him, but it was useless. No, I don't know how badly he might be wounded. Yes, I believe I can put a name to him. Henry Dobson. No, I can't prove it. But who else would come here prowling about the house at that late hour? We'll have to wait until Fillmore Gilbert is well enough to tell us what happened to him. That should help us explain the events of last night. Will he come back, do you think? If he's been here twice now, will he try a third time? I don't—" Rutledge broke off. "My good God," he said, and pushing back from the breakfast table, he ran for the stairs. Sending the protesting nurse out of the room, he shoved a chair closer to the bed and said, "Gilbert, you've got to talk to me. What does Claudia have to do with this? Does she know something about this trial? Are you afraid the man who did this to you discovered she does and will go after her next because of it? Is she holding something for you that he wants?" But Gilbert ignored him, turning his head away. His lunch tray sat untouched on the table by the bed, as if the man had already left life behind but hadn't yet found death. "I know who we are dealing with. I know he's Evan Dobson's son. We're going to find him now that we have a name. But until we do, is Claudia safe? Should I warn her? Bring her here? Gilbert, for God's sake, you have to tell me what it is you're afraid of. He was back here again last night, Dobson, and he failed a second time to kill you. Damn it, man, speak to me!" The man in the bed moved until he could look Rutledge in the eyes. His own were blazing, the only part of the shrunken figure that was alive. "Damn you! Leave it alone!" His voice was rasping as if his throat was parched. Rutledge reached for the glass of water, offering it to him, but Gilbert shoved it away with surprising strength. "I can't leave it alone," Rutledge said. "You aren't Henry Dobson's only victim. There are at least 2 more out there who are in danger. And there's Claudia, unaware of the danger she may be in. I've got to find him, and I can't do it all on my own. What does Claudia know? What if he harms her sons?" He waited, but Gilbert had nothing more to say. After a moment, Rutledge turned and walked out of the room, gesturing to the impatient nurse that she could return to her duty. Why was Gilbert refusing to help? Rutledge could think of several reasons. That what had happened to him was a shock. He'd been a barrister all his life, and a Crown prosecutor. He'd sent men to jail and to the gallows, and no one had ever touched him. The man he had been would have put up a stiff fight against Dobson, and possibly even won. This shrunken shell had been helpless, vulnerable. Already losing its grip on the mind that had made him famous, he was now beset with physical infirmities as well. Death had nearly snatched him away, and at the last moment he'd been brought back to a world he didn't want to face. Was that it? Or did Gilbert even know why he had nearly been murdered? Had Evan Dobson receded so far into the shadows of his memory that the appearance of the dead man's son was confusing, inexplicable? Was he hiding from himself there in the darkness of his mind because he had been helpless to understand, helpless to save himself by comprehending what Dobson wanted? It was a shocking possibility. Rutledge thought about his own father, who had still been vigorous and strong when he died. Cut off too soon, everyone had said. But perhaps the other way to see it was that he'd never had to grow old, ill, forgetful, and dependent. He went down the stairs and out to the motor car. If Gilbert refused to tell him what he needed to know, perhaps Claudia could. He stopped in Tunbridge long enough to speak to Inspector Williams, giving him the little information he had about Dobson. "Wounded, you say? By whom?" "I used the revolver belonging to the victim. I was interviewed by your man at the house. It's all there in my statement. Dobson has killed several times over. We're not convinced he won't kill again. And so I fired." "Pity you didn't bring him down," Williams said harshly, "and save the rest of us a good deal of trouble." "All right, I'll send out a request to report anyone coming into hospital or a doctor's surgery with anything that could be seen as a gunshot wound. Give me a description." Rutledge told him. Others who have seen him, he added, have said that he was not the sort of young man anyone would expect to be violent. If he's what you claim he is, a man of little education, how has he been able to elude the police so long? Because we didn't know where to look. It's as simple as that. No one connected the deaths. No one looked beyond them. It took time. Sadly, more time than we had. I don't want to hear that someone else has died. I'm glad my own patch is relatively quiet, William said, shaking his head. We haven't had to deal with anything like this. But then, ever since the Ripper case, we've known such a thing could happen. I'll stay with simple lust, jealousy and greed, thank you very much. As Rutledge rose to leave, Williams added, What's the news in London? Any hope that the Belgians will hold? They're fighting hard, but they can't possibly go on much longer. Outnumbered and without the weaponry to match what's being thrown against them. Still, long enough to get our men over there to back them up. I think that's what Belgium is hoping for. I've heard the French are ready. But once Belgium is finished, it'll be Paris the Germans want. For my part, they're welcome to it. Never cared for the French. A stiff-necked people. Rutledge smiled. You shouldn't speak ill of our allies. We may soon be standing shoulder to shoulder with them along the Marne. I'll leave the fighting to the young. Williams pointed to his greying temples. We'll need someone left in England to keep the criminal class from taking over. From there, Rutledge drove to Portsmouth. Claudia Upchurch's husband had a surgery in the town, but he'd chosen to live just outside in a village where the house had a distant view down to the sea. Rutledge found Claudia at home. He'd met her a number of times over the years, but she had been older and so he hadn't known her well. She had always struck him as sensible and clear-headed, very like her father in his prime. All the way to Portsmouth he hoped he was right in his judgment of her. The last thing he needed was panic. She walked into the room where he was waiting, and she looked harried. His first thought was that she must have heard the news about her father from someone else. Dr. Greening. But her welcome was cheerful and warm, not fearful. Ian? My goodness, it's been a while. How are you? Claudia had inherited her mother's auburn hair and her father's features cast into a more feminine mould. Rather than pretty, she was striking, and she had the taste in clothing that emphasized this. Today she was wearing a soft green summer dress with white lace trim, and it gave the appearance of cool elegance. I'm well, Claudia. And Sydney? The boys? The boys have been taken to the seashore today. It's Sydney's birthday, and I've arranged a small surprise party for a number of his friends. Trying to keep a secret from 3 active youngsters has been a nightmare. And I had to lie to Sydney these past several days because we've been cleaning and polishing everything in sight. Of course, he would notice just when one doesn't want him to. You will stay, of course, and wish him many happy returns of the day? As much as I'd enjoy staying, I'm afraid I can't. Can you spare me a few minutes? I need to talk to you. It sounds serious, she said, gesturing to a chair. Your father's memory isn't what it once was. I'm sure you're aware of that. I'm curious about a trial in Bristol some years ago. You were a child, but I wonder if he ever spoke of it to you. One Evan Dobson was charged with the murder of a greengrocer by the name of Atkins. Frowning, she considered the question. The name doesn't mean anything to me, Ian. He talked to Mamma about his briefs sometimes, but seldom to me. Did you know he started to write his memoirs? but I don't think he actually got very far. I've wondered if that was an excuse to withdraw from London and his friends there, to hide the fact that his memory had started to fail." She shook her head sadly. "That's been a burden to him. The worst possible thing for a man who remembered everything." "Was there any trial that particularly worried him, that he seemed to wish had turned out differently?" Rutledge pursued. She stared at him. "Are you asking me if he ever felt an innocent man was convicted?" "I don't think it's that sort of thing." He gestured ruefully. "I really don't know what I'm looking for. Did he ever confide in you? Give you something to keep? Something he might have felt was safer in your care? Perhaps something in his files that he discovered or heard or learned too late to save a convicted man? Something, in short, that Dobson might think would exonerate his father." "That doesn't sound like Papa. He was a good judge of character," he said, "and he was thorough. I know because I asked him that very question once when I was 16 and thought I knew everything." She glanced toward the sitting-room door. He could hear one of the maids calling to another. "I must be sure they have what they need. Is that all, Ian?" "Not quite. Someone has attacked your father. No," he added quickly as she turned to him in alarm, "he doesn't want you to rush to Swan Walk and make a fuss. But we haven't caught the man yet. And I'm concerned that he might be mad enough to come here, looking for you." "For me?" she said blankly. "It has to do with the case I just asked you about. I may be wrong, but it's foolish to take chances. Lock your windows and doors tonight. Don't let anyone in after dark. I'll ask for a constable to come and keep watch." Her eyes strayed to the sounds in the passage. "But the party? What am I to do about that? And the boys, what shall I tell them?" "You know the people who have been invited. You'll be safe enough. But let the constable walk with you through the house afterward to make certain all is well. This is no idle threat. The man is dangerous. I'm sorry to worry you, Claudia, but I wouldn't have come if I hadn't believed it was important." "But you'll stay, won't you? And explain all this to Sydney?" "I can't. There are others at risk. I must go, but don't trust anyone you haven't known for quite some time. This man has tricked his way into a number of homes because he doesn't look threatening. Remember that." He carefully described Dobson. "He could even claim he has a message from your father, or that your father is dying and you're to leave at once for Swan Walk. He might tell you someone has been badly hurt and Sydney is urgently needed in order to get him out of the house. Don't believe him." He rose. "You're needed elsewhere. Just promise me you won't take this lightly, even if Sydney thinks it's a foolish precaution." "I promise," she said uneasily, standing up and following him to the door. "I must say you frightened me more than a little." "I'm sorry." He took her hand. "Keep your wits about you." She went with him to the door and stood outside in the warm sunlight, but she had wrapped her arms around her as if she were cold. "You're telling me the truth, Ian? That my father is all right?" Not wanting to lie to her, he said, "He's a stubborn old fool, and Dr. Greening is despairing of him." Claudia managed to smile. "Yes, that's just like him. When you see him, give him my love." He bent to turn the crank. Claudia hurried back inside and closed the door firmly. Rutledge took a deep breath. Now to find the nearest police station. It was in the village, and Rutledge had to use his authority as an inspector at Scotland Yard to convince the constable on duty that the threat to the Upchurch family was real and immediate. To be on the safe side, he drove the man back to the house to be sure he got there sooner rather than later. Claudia's relief at seeing him went a long way toward convincing the man that Rutledge had been right to take precautions. In for a penny, in for a pound. He filled the motorcar with petrol and turned toward Wells. The solicitor, Simmons, was in, he was told. The man looked up as Rutledge stepped into his office and said, "Oh, God, what is it now?" "A different matter from the Tattersall inquiry. At least I hope it is. Your father was a barrister, wasn't he? It says Simmons and Simmons on the door." "My father and I were solicitors. The barrister was his elder brother, my uncle. He had chambers in Bristol. When he died, most of his files came to us." "Why?" "Can you tell me if he defended one Evan Dobson against a charge of murder?" He gave Simmons the date and the details. Simmons shrugged. "God knows. We've got his files somewhere. Barry, my clerk, could probably put his hands on them." "Would you ask him to have a look? It's rather important." "I can't see how that will help you. It's ancient history." "I'm sure it is. But there may be something in the file that would help me understand the dead man's son. And perhaps explain," he added silently, "why Gilbert's daughter was at risk." Simmons rose and came around his desk. "Very well, let's get on with it." Simmons had been right about his clerk. The man led Rutledge into a back room where the firm's history was shelved by name and date. In 20 minutes' time, he'd pulled down the box that held what Rutledge wanted. He was given the clerk's desk to use as he sorted through the file. The papers from the Bristol chambers were yellowed, the ink fading in places, but he could read the lot. The elder Simmons had had no illusions about his client's guilt or innocence, but he did what he could to convince the jury that there was doubt. Enough that a clear conviction would be impossible. And here, amongst these papers, was something that Lucy Muir hadn't discovered, or hadn't realized was important. Atkins, the greengrocer's son, had been represented by the elder Simmons in another case 5 years after the Dobson trial for his role in a drunken brawl. The note pointed the reader to that file, describing Atkins as now a resident of Wells. 5 years after Evan Dobson was hanged, young Atkins had already sold the greengrocer's shop and moved away from the village of Beecham to the town of Wells. Rutledge finished the file a few minutes before the clerk came in to ask if he wished to keep the box out for a second day. It was a polite way of telling him that Barry was ready to go home and Rutledge was keeping him from his dinner. He passed the box to the clerk, saying, "I believe I'm finished. Can you tell me if anyone else has looked at this material recently?" "I don't believe anyone has looked at it since the elder Mr. Simmons, the present Mr. Simmons's uncle, died in 1903. "Not even when someone broke into this office?" "Nothing was taken. Nothing seemed to be disturbed." But Tattersall's box was here, and Evan Dobson's as well. And Dobson's son had known where to find them. Rutledge said as he watched Barry restore the box to its rightful place, "Why would a man of Simmons's standing in the legal community agree to take on an indigent leather worker as a client? I'm certain the Dobson family had very little money at the time Evan Dobson was tried." The clerk led the way out of the storeroom and locked it behind them. "Mr. Simmons felt it to be his Christian duty to represent the poor. He often took on at least one such case a year." Do you know anything about a Thomas Atkins? He moved from Beecham to Wells in the 1890s, Rutledge asked as they walked to the door. He was something of a troublemaker. The elder Mr. Simmons represented him at least once. The clerk's eyebrows rose. He repeated the name. Odd that you should ask, sir. Thomas Atkins fell out of the loft of his barn and impaled himself on his own pitchfork, only last month. A nasty business, that. And not too many days before Mr. Tattersall was found dead. Barry was careful not to use the word suicide. Rutledge remembered Inspector Holliston's words when first he'd called on him about the inquiry into Tattersall's death. He'd been listing the reasons why he'd sent for the Yard in the Tattersall case. He'd already had his hands full. A hanging. We haven't decided if it's suicide or murder. A man killed in his farmyard, but we aren't certain whether it's murder or an accident. Fell out of the loft window onto his own pitchfork. A drowning that could be suspicious. There were enough people eager to kill the bastard. I wouldn't be surprised if one of them did it. And now, Tattersall's death. Rutledge had had reason to believe that Holliston had wanted to stay clear of anything to do with the solicitor Simmons. There had seemed to be no reason for the Yard to inquire into the other cases. A departure from Dobson's usual method of dispatching his victims. He had chosen a brutal way to see to Atkins. What's more, it hadn't drawn the Yard's attention. The connection with Tattersall and Henry Dobson hadn't been discovered to cast a new light on Atkins's death. Rutledge thanked Barry, said good night, and walked on to the police station. He found Holliston just leaving his own office on his way home to dinner. "Rutledge," he said, grimacing, "I thought we'd seen the last of you. I've heard Joel Tattersall's death had been put down to suicide, but out of courtesy to the man's sister, that hadn't been listed as the final verdict." "It's still open to question," Rutledge replied. "Meanwhile, there's another matter of interest to the Yard. Thomas Atkinson's death." "How the hell did you hear about that?" Holliston stared at him. "You told me yourself, while giving me the reasons you had handed the Tattersall case to the Yard. You never mentioned a name. Even if you had, it wouldn't have mattered. I didn't know Atkins existed at that stage. He was involved in a murder in Beecham some years ago. I don't think the fall from the barn loft was an accident. Someone had found him and killed him. Very likely around the time of the break-in at the solicitor's chambers." "I don't know anything about that," Holliston said. "Come inside. This is no place to discuss Atkins." They went into Holliston's office and he paused to light the lamp. "The days are drawing in," he said as he sat down at his desk. "About Atkins. His death was determined to be an accident. He was alone at the time and he often worked in the barn. There was no evidence to lead us to believe anything else. His tenant was in Wells looking at a bull to improve the herd." He shrugged. "Not that anyone was surprised. Atkins had taken to drinking some years ago. That's why he couldn't afford more help. And there was a bottle in the barn, half empty. All in all, he was a troubled and troublesome man. He bought that farm with money of his own, but he wasn't suited to it. His wife left him. He'd been involved in a number of schemes that never worked out the way he'd hoped, and that's when the drinking started. There were bruises on the body that weren't consistent with the fall, but Atkins was always resorting to his fists if he thought he'd been crossed. All right, I've told you what I know about Atkins. Now, It's your turn to explain what this is about." When Rutledge had finished, Holliston whistled. "Are you certain about this?" "As certain as I can be." "But there was alcohol in Atkins's stomach, not laudanum." "In this case, perhaps laudanum was too gentle a weapon." Holliston rubbed his face with both hands, then looked across at Rutledge. "The inquest brought in its verdict. That will have to be changed to murder." "Where is Dobson now?" "We don't know. Possibly on his way to Portsmouth." "I'll keep you informed." "Thanks." They walked out together into the dusk. Holliston added, "I'll speak to the doctor again, about those bruises and abrasions. See what he can tell me in light of this information." "A good idea." Rutledge turned to crank the motor car. "I wish we knew where Dobson was tonight. I'd rest easier. And so would Fillmore Gilbert." By the time Rutledge reached Swan Walk, it was nearly dawn. He stopped by the closed gates. All was quiet. More bunches of flowers had replaced the wilted ones, and the huge crepe bows fluttered in the light wind, black splashes like great spiders in the web of the iron pattern. He debated waking the household, decided against it, and drove on to Melinda's house, where he knew he had a bed. She was happy to see him, and his room, as always, was ready. She insisted that he must have a plate of sandwiches and something to drink, and he humoured her while she filled him in on the news from Belgium. "They are the bravest of the brave," she said. Sadness and pride mingled in her voice. "They've stopped the advancing German army at Liège. No one thought it was possible. But they can't hold forever, Ian. It's a question of when and not if the Germans smash their way through. Meanwhile, London is flooded with refugees. Those who can flee are leaving for fear of retribution once the Germans capture the country." "And what are we doing?" Most of the British General Staff knew Melinda Crawford. Rutledge was reminded once more of Gilbert's comments about the army as a family. "Scrambling to put together an expeditionary force," she said. "We're spread thin, and I expect Kaiser Wilhelm knew this. I expect he believed he'd have France, Paris at least, before he could be stopped." "And the French?" "It's a long border. Colonel Crawford tells me the Germans intend to use the Marne Valley to lead them straight to Paris, while another force secures the Channel coast so that the French can't be reinforced or resupplied from Britain, effectively cutting France off." If Colonel Crawford was worried, Rutledge thought, there was good reason for it. Melinda's cousin wouldn't alarm her unnecessarily. Rutledge had met him a number of times at Melinda's house, and he knew Crawford was an experienced and steady man, with a clear understanding of strategy and tactics. "There's something else, Ian. Most of our generals are accustomed to a very different kind of war. What everyone took to calling Victoria's little wars. The Indian Mutiny, South Africa, the Mahdi. Nasty enough, whatever you wish to call them, but nothing on the scale of what happened under Napoleon, when all of Europe was engaged. And in the end, of course, we were bound to win, however bloody it was. I'm not so sure here. Napoleon was a superb general. We can only pray that the Kaiser isn't." It was unlike her to be pessimistic. Rutledge said, "Then this rush to enlist might well be a blessing after all." She studied him for a moment. "You aren't planning to do anything rash?" He smiled. "My hands are full with yard business at the moment." "See that they stay that way. I've lost a father and a husband to the army, and I'm afraid Simon Brandon will be called back to active duty. You remember Simon? I should hate to lose that young man too. Or Ross. When last I saw him he was talking about the Royal Navy. And so many others I know. Even Ram was asking permission to go back to India and enlist, I ask you. At his age." Ram kept her motorcar in perfect condition. Rutledge had had a look at the motor, and he'd told Melinda later that he'd nearly been blinded by the gleaming brass and copper. Rutledge shook his head. "Temporary madness. It will pass." But she wasn't convinced. Later he tried to call the yard using Melinda's telephone. But Gibson hadn't come in and Cummins was in a meeting. Rutledge was told to call back later. He went up to his room and slept. Chapter 18. It was late morning before Rutledge could reach Cummins at the yard, and even then Cummins was brief. "I'll ring you back at this number, shall I, in 5 minutes?" Rutledge agreed and waited, impatiently pacing the passage before finally walking out to the terrace. Hearing the telephone bell at last, he raced back inside. Cummins said, "Sorry, everyone could hear me. Bowles is out for the morning and I've commandeered his office so that we can both speak freely." Rutledge asked, "Has Gibson traced either Chaston or Taylor?" "Both, as a matter of fact. Taylor is in a Bristol hospital with pneumonia at the moment. Chaston, on the other hand, lives in Torquay. I've been trying to reach someone in the police force there." "Damn! I was just in Portsmouth speaking with Gilbert's daughter, Claudia Upchurch. I wish I'd known." "Where are you now?" "Back in Kent. I'm on my way to call on Mrs. Hadley." He gave the Chief Inspector a brief summary of what he'd done. "The younger Atkins, the greengrocer's son, is dead. There's no proof, but I'd guess that Dobson got to him early on." "That just about rounds it out, doesn't it? I've sent word to the Chief Constable of Kent that we want to know if a man with a gunshot wound shows up anywhere for treatment. He'll see that the word is passed." "We don't know how far he was able to travel." "Still, never hurts to be sure." Rutledge said, "I needn't go on to Aylesbridge, then." "Tell me more about Chaston. That's where I'll find Dobson. He can't reach Taylor until the man is out of hospital." Cummins gave him the information, then said in a different tone of voice, "There's a problem here. For one thing, I've been talking to Bowles. The evidence is clear enough. Dobson's victims, save for Atkins, of course, drank that milk of their own accord. It wasn't forced down their throats. They weren't under physical duress. If Henry Dobson was present, it's damned macabre, but I don't see how that will convict him of murder. Look at it from the Chief Superintendent's point of view, Ian. Even if you bring in Dobson, he can claim that he's not accountable for these deaths, that he'd come to ask about his father's trial and that guilt drove these men to suicide. There's a very good chance he can make a jury believe him." Rutledge could feel a surge of anger at Gilbert, lying in his bed, his face to the wall, refusing to help the police, refusing to tell what he remembered about the night he nearly died. "Go on," he said. The telephone had one advantage, he thought in another corner of his mind. Cummins couldn't see his face, read his eyes. "And then there's the Hadley murder." Rutledge could hear Cummins take a deep breath before going on. "Watson, the man in Kent, is pressing for us to have another look at Peggy Good, the housemaid who found the body. He's convinced that with Mrs. Hadley in Cadbury, Hadley could have made advances and she tried to stop him by drugging him. Only the dose was fatal. She would be more likely to scream the house down. What's more, she found the body. He thinks she came in to see if the drug had worn off and if he was angry." Cummins cleared his throat. "She was terrified to find him dead." "Simple answers are the best. That's the chief superintendent's motto. You know that." Rutledge needed to pace, to think, but Melinda's telephone closet was too small. "What should I do? Let Kingston stand his trial and hope a jury will refuse to convict him? Let Gilbert die without speaking as he wishes to do? And give up on Hadley? I can't do any of that. I'm going to Torquay to find Terence Chaston before Dobson does. He may know something. For my part, I think you need a spot of leave. I have no way of knowing what my men do when they aren't on duty. Do you think Sergeant Gibson grows roses?" Rutledge laughed, breaking the tension between the two men. Then he sobered. "Arrest will terrify Peggy Good, and even if she's not convicted, she'll be marked for life. Mrs. Hadley might not want her back. How is she to earn her living? Try to convince Inspector Watson to hold off. Tell him we're evaluating new evidence." "I don't know if I can persuade him. You'll have to give me something to use as an argument." "God knows. Or, all right, tell Bowles and Inspector Watson that I'm waiting for a list of the hop workers to interview them. And that will take some time. It's possible Hadley left those study windows open because he was expecting someone to come that way. Certainly not Peggy Good. It might work, but hurry, Ian. We're dealing with Bowles." Rutledge put up the receiver and went back to the terrace. Melinda was waiting for him, sitting in her favourite chair. "It's Torquay. That's where our next victim is. And then possibly back to Bristol when Taylor is well enough to go home." She held out her hand to him and he took it. "Good luck, my dear. And somehow find the time to write to Jean. She'll be unhappy if she doesn't hear. To Frances, too. She still hasn't agreed to a companion. At least your housekeeper is a sensible woman. That will help." Gibson had discovered a good deal about one Terence Chaston. Chaston had owned a Bristol foundry that specialised in tool-making before broadening its trade as the city grew to include manufacturing scientific equipment. Some years later, he sold out to a competitor for a good price and moved to Torquay, where his brother lived. His brother owned a thriving bakery there, catering to the carriage trade. According to Gibson, the shop had moved to its present location 5 years ago, and Fred Chaston, the brother, had taken on more staff to keep up with demand. Torquay on Devon's southern coast had been built to the north of the broad expanse of Tor Bay, once an anchorage for the Royal Navy. Now a popular seaside resort, it was still busy this late in the season. Rutledge failed to find Chaston at his house, on a side street above a narrow wooded park where modest villas had been put up before the turn of the century. A constable at the local police station gave him a description of the man, suggesting that he might be in the town at this time of day. Rutledge finally ran him to earth just as Chaston was coming out of an afternoon musical concert in the domed confection of the pavilion. A tall, thin man with reddish hair and freckles that hadn't faded with age. He frowned at Rutledge and said, "Scotland Yard? What could you possibly want with me?" "Is there someone we can talk privately?" "I have a small room for business above the bakery. Will that do?" The two men walked along the shaded streets to the heart of town, where the large baker's shop stood between a stationer's and a bookshop. The bakery was busy, and the women who came and went were prosperous and well-dressed. Gibson had been right about the shop's popularity. "We're thinking of adding a tea shop," Chaston said as they crossed the street toward it. "That's if we can convince the stationer to sell. We'll see." Instead of entering through the main door as Rutledge had expected, Chaston led him down a narrow service alley that ran between the bakery and the bookshop. A door toward the rear opened into a room piled with sacks of flour and sugar and tins of lard. A stairway to one side led up to the first floor. The previous owner lived above the shop. My brother uses the space for storage and an office. This way. They climbed the steps and came out into a passage with several doors opening off of it. Rutledge could smell spices, and Chaston, looking over his shoulder, smiled. I'm used to it, but I'm told my clothes reek of cinnamon and nutmeg and cloves. That room over there is where they're stored. Ever since that business in Sarajevo with the Archduke, I've doubled our orders of everything that has to come in by ship. The Germans have a large fleet of submarines. We'll find ourselves blockaded soon enough, mark my words. The room he called his office was small, littered with bills and ledgers, and even possessed a typewriter. I've taken over the bakery's accounts. The baking I leave to my brother and his staff. Fred doesn't have a good head for business, and retirement no longer suits me. You lived in Bristol before coming here? Rutledge asked as he took the chair in front of the cluttered desk. I did. I was made a good offer for my firm there, and it seemed foolish not to take it. Are you married? No. I never really had time to find myself a wife. While you were living in Bristol, did you serve on a jury? Chaston's face closed. Why do you ask? I'll take that as a yes. You needn't be concerned. It isn't the trial I'm interested in. However, it's the trial where all this began. Were you aware that Evan Dobson had a young son at the time he was charged with murder? Dobson's wife was in the gallery. I didn't know that until when the verdict was read and she fainted. I wasn't aware of a son. His mother died in June of this year. Since then, Henry Dobson has disappeared. And that's our problem. It appears that he's trying to right what he perceives to be a wrong. Or he may view it as simple revenge. If that's true, you're very likely the next person on this man's list of victims. When he leaves your house, you'll probably be dead by your own hand. You are worrying me, Mr. Rutledge. And so you should be. Rutledge gave him a concise account of the other murders, holding very little back. Chaston listened without expression, then shook his head. I have a difficult time believing that 4 able, intelligent men would calmly sit there and drink down a potion that they knew would kill them. There must have been something else to account for what they did. And you said yourself that in each case the Yard was prepared to accept another plausible explanation for what happened. Until, that is, you uncovered this connection to a trial. Rutledge wondered then if Henry Dobson's other victims would have told him the same thing. That a warning would have done little or no good. He persevered. It's an easier death than many choices a man might make. It's also quieter, which I think is one of the reasons it was chosen. If he doesn't believe his father was innocent, why does he want to kill the judge and jury? Besides, there was nothing about the trial that was unfair or questionable. The evidence, as I recall, was straightforward. We did question among ourselves what role the dead man's son might have played, but he wasn't the one who raised a fist to the older man. The son, Atkins, fell out of the loft of his barn, directly onto a pitchfork. Coincidence? Or Dobson's doing? Remember, no one ever paid for that bridal, and there must have been very little money for Mrs. Dobson and her son to live on after his father's arrest. A child can grow up to hate when he watches his mother shunned and suffering. All right. He feels he must kill the greengrocer's son. That makes a little more sense. But the jury? We didn't ask to serve after all. The logic of a man of business who's never gone to bed hungry or done menial work to put food on his table or clothes on his back. That could be precisely what Dobson sees when he looks at the list of names. With the possible exception of the annex schoolmaster, a good many of you went on to happy, uneventful lives. Well, I thank you for the warning, Mr. Rutledge. I will most certainly be on my guard. If I could find you so easily, Dobson will be able to do the same. He will come at night, when he can be sure you're alone. I expect he watches and bides his time. I understand. But Rutledge didn't believe Chaston did. Chaston was arrogant. He built a company, sold it for a profit, and come to Torquay to lead a more leisurely life. Before very long he'd begun to take charge of his less successful brother's bakery, as he himself had said, leaving the baking to the staff. Even setting up an office for himself in the unused rooms above. How long before his brother found himself managed into a position of having very little to say about his own shop? There was nothing more he could do here. Rutledge rose, thanked Chaston for his time, and found his own way out. Walking back to where he'd left the motor car, he asked himself what more he could have said to convince Chaston to pay attention to his warning. Exasperated with the man, Rutledge spent the next hour and a half driving the streets of Torquay. He'd seen Dobson walk, he'd seen him run. Broad shoulders, a slim build. Was he limping? Carrying his arm stiffly? Or already fully recovered from his gunshot wound? He got nowhere. In the end, he sought out the police station and described for the sergeant on duty a man that the yard considered a person of interest. If you find Dobson, he should be taken into custody at once, and Chief Inspector Cummins at the yard should be notified. He'll send someone down to question the man. What's he done, then, that the yard wants him? He's a witness to murder, Rutledge said. We want him badly. The sergeant looked at his notes and said bluntly, This could describe any number of men. I don't hold out much hope. He has a Somerset accent. It's likely he uses a bicycle to travel, and he suffered a gunshot wound fairly recently. That should help. The sergeant looked up at that. I'll put out the word. Rutledge went back to his motor car and found a hotel where he could spend the night. He slept for an hour or two, then dressed and walked to the tree-lined street where Chaston lived. Solidly middle-class and comfortable, number 21 sat at the top of a half-dozen steps. There were hydrangeas and smaller plantings on either side of the short walk to the door. Rutledge found a vantage point down the street from which he could watch the house, and settled himself as best he could. There was a sharp breeze off the sea that hadn't dropped with sunset, and before long he felt its bite. He stayed there until an hour before sunrise, when it would soon be too light for someone to hide. And there was no sign of Dobson. It had been a long shot, he told himself as he headed back to the hotel. And yet all that previous afternoon he'd had a feeling that Dobson was here in Torquay. Was it possible he hadn't found Chaston yet? Or was he still troubled by his wound? He couldn't afford to be noticeably injured. Any sign of weakness, and he couldn't be sure his victim wouldn't put up a very good fight. Rutledge slept for several hours, came down for a late breakfast, and saw the black headlines in the morning paper. They painted a dire picture of Belgium's plight. The army, pathetically small to begin with, still held out. But losses were heavy, and it was thought that they would have to surrender soon, or face utter annihilation. And there were reports of atrocities as the frustrated German army turned on civilians. Refugees reported witnessing many horrors, but there was no independent confirmation. Still, posters were appearing that showed Belgium's suffering, and this had increased enlistments. Meanwhile, a British expeditionary force was preparing to go to Belgium's aid. Rutledge set the paper aside. He had visited Belgium and France a time or two while a student at Oxford. The place names were familiar to him. He had been to Liège, to Bruges, and Brussels. He had seen the fort where the worst of the fighting was taking place. It made the war personal. He waited 2 more days in Torquay, keeping watch at night until he began to worry about Taylor, the policeman who had come with his men to take Evan Dobson into custody. Was he still in hospital, or sent home? After some difficulty, he found a telephone and put in a call to the yard. Sergeant Gibson reported that Taylor's pneumonia had begun to improve, but he was in hospital still and very weak. There was talk of a convalescent home when he was finally released. What's more, reports from the constable keeping watch on Fillmore Gilbert were not encouraging.
"He's eating, not with appetite, mind you, but eating. It's a start."
Gibson's voice had an echo of doubt in it. Rutledge remembered Gilbert pushing Wave in a glass of water. "A start," he agreed. "But I want to know as soon as he is talking."
"There's a new inquiry on your desk," Gibson added.
"Pray God, nothing to do with laudanum."
"A shotgun," Gibson said. "Sir."
Rutledge thanked him and put up the receiver. Where the hell was Dobson? If he wasn't in Torquay, and Taylor's illness in Bristol presented a temporary obstruction, where was he? Rutledge wasn't completely convinced that being hunted himself had deterred Dobson. He wouldn't have come back to Swan Walk if that were true. His wound, then? Or had he spotted Rutledge in Torquay and simply decided he could outwait Scotland Yard? In the end, Rutledge spoke to the local police again, asking for a watch to be set on Chaston's house. The Torquay inspector, whose wife bought her breads and cakes from the Chaston bakery, agreed to send a constable.
"Or I'll have nothing for my tea," he said with a wry smile. "My wife has no time for baking. She's on a war committee, God help us all."
The plight of Belgium was the talk of the city when Rutledge reached London. Jean and her mother had joined a charity to help Belgian refugees, many of whom had escaped from the fighting through Le Havre. Some had decided to remain in France because they were French-speaking, while others, already in a state of shock at what was happening to their country, were unconvinced that France herself could hold. Rutledge had arrived just after 6, and was dragooned into helping at one of the teas organised to raise money. And he listened to the speakers who had been invited to tell their stories. They were harrowing. Families separated, husbands at the front, children without parents. It was enough to open the pocketbooks of those present, and afterward Rutledge spoke to one of the men. He'd been a policeman in Liège, wounded in the fighting even though he wasn't with the army, and suspected of being a saboteur. And so he had left hastily, to avoid being taken by the Germans. "It's an unfair fight," he said in perfectly good English. "We have no artillery, only machine guns. But we know the countryside. We know each other and we know how to defend ourselves. Learning to use a rifle is not difficult. Learning to kill a man with it is harder. But the time comes when we must decide. Let them kill me or kill them first and worry about my soul later." When the evening was over, Jean had asked what Rutledge and the middle-aged Belgian had found to talk about. "Realities," he said, and changed the subject. The next day, when he went back to the yard, he learned that Mrs. Hadley had given the policeman who had come to arrest Peggy Good a very difficult time, and they had had to withdraw to lick their wounds.
She told them in no uncertain terms, Cummins related to Rutledge, fighting to keep a straight face, that if they took her maid into custody on such ridiculous charges, she would see to it that Inspector Watson was reduced to constable for his ineptness and his blind disregard of facts staring him in the face. As the Hadleys were on friendly terms with the Chief Constable and Mrs. Hadley has an uncle in the Home Office, Watson backed down, even apologised for disturbing her. He sent a telegram to the Chief Superintendent, but Mrs. Hadley's connections put Bowles off as well. I advised him to let everyone cool down.
This is the end of the disc. The audiobook continues on the next disc.
It was galling for Rutledge to admit to Cummins that he hadn't brought in Dobson. Afterward, he walked on to his own office and began to work his way through the files sitting on his desk before looking at his latest assignment. Jean would be pleased, he thought, that he would be in London for the near future. The inquiry was in Hampstead, a dispute over a will that had escalated into violence. "There's so much happening, Ian," she had told him just last night as he'd driven her home. "We've been working with the refugees, as you know, and there's another tea coming up, and a dinner party tomorrow night. Papa had promised to be here, but we aren't quite sure where he is at the moment. He's been out of touch, and Mamma feels he's already in France. There's a charity auction next week, and we've been assured that a member of the royal family will attend. Mamma is going to ask you to escort us." In fairness to her, he had agreed to help in any way he could. That evening, after another charity event, she asked, when her mother had gone upstairs, giving them a few minutes alone, "Have you given any thought to being married in September? If Papa has leave, we could find a way to arrange it. I've had the last fitting for my gown. If we were married, surely the Yard would understand and not send you so far away." He couldn't tell her that the Yard cared little for the happiness of its men. Murder didn't wait on the convenience of a policeman or the arrangements made by his wife. She would come to accept this, as most women did. Mrs. Cummins had a very active social life, a large group of friends. It occurred to him that he could ask Cummins for advice. He had met Mrs. Cummins. He thought she would be kind to Jean and help her. But he still had qualms, and he said then, "Jean, are you sure you'll be happy as a policeman's wife?" She laughed. "I've been a soldier's daughter. Why should it be any different? And I love you, Ian, more than you know. We'll be happy, I promise you." Earlier, he'd found Frances at home dressing to go out for the evening. She asked for his help doing up the buttons in the back of her gown and reminded him that there was a cold chicken in the kitchen, if he had no other plans. "Who's the lucky fellow tonight?" He stood back to admire her in the dark blue gown. "You'll break his heart." "He hasn't a heart to break. But he's such fun, and I need to think about something other than the war. Those poor Belgians. We're so lucky, Ian." She shivered. "I want it to stay that way forever." He kissed her cheek. "I'll be late myself. I must drive Mrs. Gordon and Jean back home when the event is over." But the event was marred by the news from France. Belgium had lost its fight with Germany. The German army was now racing toward the French frontier. Chapter 19. Through Cummins, Rutledge was able to stay in touch with Torquay, Tunbridge, and Bristol. Taylor was now in the convalescent home, still surrounded by nurses and patients and doctors. That was very good news. Chaston, on the other hand, had tired of the watch on his house and had asked that it be withdrawn. Torquay, also suffering from a shortage of men, was happy to agree. Rutledge swore in frustration when he heard the news. Gilbert still refused to speak. Rutledge tried to understand his silence, but there was nothing he could do about it. In Kent, the inquest on the death of Jerome Hadley was to be recalled. Henry Dobson, meanwhile, appeared to have vanished. Cummins was of the opinion that this was good news. Rutledge, who had tracked him for weeks now, was convinced he was simply waiting. From Hampstead, Rutledge was sent to Carlisle and then on to Derby. He was grateful that all 3 inquiries had been straightforward, swiftly concluded. Each day that he was out of reach of London tested his patience. He took Melinda Crawford's advice and wrote letters, to Jean, to Frances, and to Melinda, at one point asking a favour of her. He was just about to leave Derby when the telegram came from Cummins. Taylor was dead. There had been a setback and he was too frail from the pneumonia to survive. That left Chaston. And Chaston had left himself vulnerable. But Dobson hadn't taken advantage of that fact. What was he waiting for? It was almost the end of August when Rutledge arrived in London from Derby, just as the first salvos of the Battle of Mons began. On the Belgian side of the border with France, the capital of Hainaut province and a city of heavy industry based on its coal, Mons was strategic. The British Expeditionary Force had reached it 2 days before in an effort to close the coast road to the Germans. The French army was poised to stop them wherever they crossed the frontier. At Mons, the battle lasted 2 days, and then the outnumbered British were forced to retreat. But they managed to do it in an orderly fashion. They were professionals and they knew what they were about, even against such odds. It was the beginning of a long, slow withdrawal toward the coast and the city of Ypres. Still in Belgium, but for how much longer? How soon would it be a French town that was besieged? London talked of nothing else. The call for volunteers had gone out afresh, and it was a race against time to train the new army and get it into the field before the British regulars had to be reinforced. Jean, greeting Rutledge when he stopped by the Gordon house on his way home, asked if he had changed his mind about volunteering. "There will be general conscription soon. It's almost certain." "You won't wait for that? Surely not." "They are saying we need every man, that it's only a matter of time before the tide is turned. Don't you want to be a part of this brave undertaking?" He'd seen the bands in the streets stirring up enthusiasm as men marched behind them in growing numbers on their way to enlist. Firms urged their young men to go, and the poor and unemployed were pressed to sign their names. "I have a duty, Jean, to a man facing trial in Moresby, to others whose lives have been cut short, to myself as a sworn officer of the law." Yet he knew men who had left the yard to fight. It had added immensely to the work those who remained had to deal with. There had been talk about calling men out of retirement if the drain on resources went on. Yes, I see that, of course I do. But you will consider it, won't you? As soon as you've finished what you must do." "Yes, all right, I promise." When he reached the yard, he sought out Cummins to ask for news. Cummins shut his office door and lowered his voice. "Taylor died of natural causes. I made certain I was kept informed. That leaves Chaston. Why hasn't Dobson tried to reach him? Is it possible that Chaston sided with Evan Dobson?" "He seemed to view the trial as a matter of duty, unpleasant but necessary, unlike Benjamin Clayton, who appeared to be disturbed by his part in it. Certainly not the sort of man Mrs. Dobson would have any reason to feel sympathetic toward." Rutledge took a deep breath. "Even if we stop the killing, there are the dead Dobsoners left behind. It isn't over." "I've wondered about that, Ian. He'd had everything his own way, until Swan Walk. He'd seemed invincible. You've shown him he wasn't. If I were Terence Chaston, I wouldn't wager my life on it.
Why won't Gilbert talk to me? I'm beginning to wonder if his mind has been damaged to the point that he can't tell us what happened that night. It's a bitter thought. Did you know the constable was recalled from Swan Walk? And from Mrs. Upchurch? The local constabularies are as short-handed as we are. Where do we stand with the Hadleys' housemaid, Peggy Good? Cummins smiled, but he was watching Rutledge's face. The inquest was reconvened and the evidence against Miss Good was presented. Mrs. Hadley was asked if she had gone to Canterbury because she was on bad terms with her husband and suspected him of straying. That was a mistake. Mrs. Hadley challenged everyone in that room to speak up at once if they possessed any knowledge of her husband's philandering. And when no one came forward, she went on to say a good bit more about the evidence in hand. She was quite knowledgeable about some matters, mentioning the fact that the police were refusing to look at other deaths too similar to her husband's to be ignored. And until they did, any verdict calling her husband's honour into question would result in dire consequences. What's more, the housekeeper and the rest of the staff backed up Mrs. Hadley, saying that they felt the police had leapt to conclusions without evidence to support them. I wonder how Mrs. Hadley came by such detailed information. You haven't been to see her, have you, Ian? No, sir, I have not. The answer was firm, unequivocal. Did you write to her? No, sir, I did not. But he had written to Melinda, whose slight acquaintance with the Hadleys provided the opportunity for a condolence call. Yes, well, however you managed it, Mrs. Hadley's speech left everyone stunned. What did the inquest say to that? They're back to person or persons unknown. Rutledge smiled for the first time. Can we work a similar magic in Moresby? Although I'm afraid we have no Mrs. Hadley there to speak for Kingston. Just the opposite, in fact. What did the chief superintendent have to say when word got back to him about the outcome? The worst of it was the Home Office wanted to know what it was all about and what this further evidence might be that was brought up in the inquest. Mrs. Hadley does indeed have friends in high places. An uncle, in fact. Cummins hesitated, then said what was on his mind. Regarding Bowles, you do know that very likely you've made an enemy for life there. I didn't set out to do that. I'm quite sure you didn't. He always weighs the main chance, Ian. He doesn't want to bring a case to trial and have it fall apart in the Crown's face. Sadly, he doesn't possess the imagination that would let him judge the difference. Rutledge said ruefully, I shall have to learn a better way to deal with him. He holds the keys to the yard, Ian. And so, yes, you will. You can run rings around him, but he must never know that, or even guess it. On to other business. I've arranged for you to give testimony in the Moresby trial. That's very good news. Thank you. Inspector Faraday won't care for it, but I'll do my best to put a spoke in his wheel. Cummins reached into his drawer and pulled out a sheet of paper. I've been saving this for you. It came yesterday from Tunbridge. It might be worth looking into, although, strictly speaking, it isn't a yard matter. Rutledge took the sheet from him and scanned it, then looked up at Cummins. It appears to be a missing person inquiry. Yes, Tunbridge forwarded it because it had to do with a wounded man. I happen to know there's nothing else on your desk at the moment. And you have a motor car, which makes the distance to Tunbridge negligible. Nodding, he said, We asked for doctors and hospitals to report gunshot wounds without any luck. Indeed. Rutledge was on his feet, his mind already busy. I'm on my way. Rutledge stopped at home and encountered Francis on the stairs as he was going up them. There you are, he said. I'm on my way to Kent. I'll take you as far as Melinda's, if you like. Thank you, Ian.
she said, holding up her face for his kiss. "But I have engagements here. This new army needs everything. And until the manufacturers catch up, there's much we can do. The weather is changing. Soldiers will soon be asking for warm stockings and sweaters and gloves. I'm working with a group of women who are willing to knit these things, but someone has to supply the patterns and the wool. And it must be khaki wool, not colours. I'm told the enemy would only be too glad to see our men decked out in blues and reds and greens. It makes sense." She was so earnest. It was a new Frances, and he was surprised by her dedication and enthusiasm. What's more, it suited her, and he told her so. "By the way, there's a letter for you in Papa's study. It's from Ross Trevor. If your letter is like mine, he's telling us he's joining the Royal Navy. He always did like the sea."
What a shock that must have been for his father.
"Yes, I think it must have been.
I'll pick it up on my way out." He went on down the stairs, pausing briefly to look at the post lying on the desk, and stopped, staring at the unfamiliar handwriting on another envelope bearing an address he knew. Terence Chaston. Torquay. Rutledge shoved it into his pocket along with Ross Trevor's letter, wondering briefly how Chaston had discovered this address rather than writing to him in care of the Yard. It was raining by the time he reached Kent, dark clouds foretelling heavier weather before nightfall. The farm he sought was south of Tunbridge and well off the main road. Even with directions, he missed the turning he was after. The house was set back from the road, Victorian and plain, but, like the barn and the outbuildings, sturdy and in good order. The woman who answered his knock looked up at the stranger on her doorstep and said hopefully, "Are you from Tunbridge? Have you found him, then?" She was middle-aged, her fair hair already tending to grey, her face lined from work and the sun. Tall and strongly built, she looked like the farmer's wife he'd been told she was. "I'm from the police, Mrs. Abbott. I've come about your missing farm worker." "Step in, then. I'm just washing up from our dinner." He followed her down the passage into the kitchen, ducking under the low lintel. It was a bright room, 4 square but large enough to feed a family at the table at the centre. 3 girls, stair-steps in age, were sitting at the table, and they stared up at him with curiosity bright in their faces. "This is Mr. Rutledge, girls, and he's come to speak to your mamma. Go and see to your chores, and then I'll read to you before bedtime." They rose reluctantly and went out the kitchen door into the yard. Mrs. Abbott watched them for a moment and then turned back to Rutledge. "The kettle's on. Would you care for tea, then?" "Yes, thank you." She busied herself with the tea things, her back to him. She said, as if it didn't matter, which told him it mattered a great deal, "Have you found Tommy, then?" "Not yet. I'm afraid we don't have enough information to be going on with. Could you tell me more about Tommy?" "Not really." She seemed wary, concentrating on measuring out tea into the pot. Then, as if making up her mind, she turned to face him. "I found him on the road, bleeding from a gash in his leg and his bicycle in the ditch. I'd been to market in Tunbridge and I was too tired to take him back there, and so I loaded him and his bicycle into my cart and came home. I didn't know what else to do." "Weren't you worried that you were taking a risk? That he was in trouble of some sort?" "It was a nasty injury, going right through his calf. I hadn't noticed that on the road, not how bad it was, because he'd wrapped it in his shirt. He was on his way home, he told me, and someone had tried to steal his bicycle. There was a long scrape on the metal bit that holds the front wheel in place. I could see it for myself, and so I believed him." "Like so many others." "Go on." "He was feverish for days. I didn't have the money for the doctor, and nor had he, but I doctored the livestock. I told myself it was no different. But it took a good bit of my time, what with the girls and the farm. I'm a widow, and I thought when he was well again he might repay me for what I did and help out here. So he did. Not that he could do much at first. He couldn't hardly walk for days, but he made himself a crutch and he did what he could. I told him I'd pay him if he'd stay on. He was good with the girls, too. Judith is 6, and he taught her how to feed the hens. She'd been afraid of the cock before. That meant Nan, who is 8, could deal with the cows, and Bethy, who is 10, could help me with the mucking out. That left time to work in the vegetable garden of an evening while the girls washed up after dinner. As he got stronger, he took on the milk cow and he did the heavy work. Said it helped his leg. What happened to him? It's been a week now. One morning, Tommy told me he thought he'd seen someone walking around outside and peering in the windows. He said he was afraid of this man and didn't want him harming us. I wondered then if he owed money to this man, if taking the bicycle was just a means to collect. Before I got round to asking him, Tommy left in the night. He'd taken the clothes I'd given him and his bicycle and a little food. That was all. He didn't touch the butter and eggs money. So it wasn't a question of theft? I'm afraid something has happened to him. He hasn't come back, although I thought he might. Then when I went into market 2 days ago, I reported him to the police as missing. I told them about the leg and how that man had worried him. And I said to tell him I wanted him back if they found him. I can't help but wonder if he was afraid for us and went home, out of that man's reach. Tommy was from Somerset. It's a long way to go on a bicycle. I wonder if his leg's up to it. But Tommy would find it easy enough to beg a lift. He'd managed to find help even in this farmhouse. Was it Dobson? If it was, then there was nothing for him in Somerset. He'd be heading for Torquay. Rutledge asked Mrs. Abbott to tell him what Tommy looked like, and her description seemed to fit, as did the wound. It also could explain where Dobson had been hiding. The youngest daughter, Judith, was peering in the kitchen window, her nose flattened against the glass. He smiled at her and she grinned back at him, a gap where her 2 front teeth belonged. I'll do what I can, he promised Mrs. Abbott, but I wouldn't hold out much hope. I expect Tommy needed to put space between himself and Kent. As for the man he saw outside, I wouldn't worry there. He could have been anxious enough to imagine him. She brought him his cup of tea. I wondered about that too, except that he did watch the road, as if someone would come down it one day. She stirred her tea and said philosophically, He did us no harm, but I'd like to have him back all the same. How strong was he by the time he left? Middling strong, I'd say. She looked squarely at Rutledge. You're not telling me he tried to go after this man, to protect us, so he wouldn't come here? I doubt it. Well, that's a relief anyway. He used to listen as I read to the children of an evening. He said his mother had always been too tired to read to him. She was a widow too, poor woman. I've managed to keep the farm going for the sake of the girls, but it's trying. He'd finished his tea and asked to see Tommy's room. But when Mrs. Abbott had taken him upstairs to the small bedroom under the eaves, there was nothing to tell him who the occupant had been. The trouble was, he wanted it to be Dobson in the worst possible way. But the burning question now was, where had he gone from here? Rutledge stopped in Tunbridge for a brief report to Inspector Williams, then drove on to Swan Walk. He didn't allow himself to hope. It was a formality only. The rain had stopped, but not for long. The crape had been removed from the gates, and there were no longer any flowers there.
He continued up to the house to find that the crepe had also been removed from the door. The housekeeper's doing? The constable was gone as well, but he knew that, although he was surprised to find the nurse had left too. What's more, Gilbert was now sitting downstairs in his usual chair overlooking the terrace. He was thinner, if that were possible, and he looked a good 10 years older, with deep lines in his face and haggard eyes. As Rutledge walked into the room and greeted him, he said, "Sit down." Rutledge brought another chair to put next to Gilbert's, remembering how he'd sat here in this room himself, covered in shawls and blankets, while Dobson watched warily from the flower beds. He glanced out at the delphiniums and saw that they were no longer blooming in profusion. It wouldn't be long before they would be faced with colder weather, even the first frost. Gilbert said, "The French brandy is on the tray. Glasses, too." "So they are." He went to pour the silky golden liquid into two of them and brought one back to Gilbert as he'd done once before. It seemed like years ago, not a matter of weeks. "War's not going well," Gilbert said, taking his first sip and then setting the glass to one side. As he did, Rutledge glimpsed the dark metal of Gilbert's revolver hidden in the shawls that kept him warm. Gilbert saw his glance. "I won't be taken by surprise ever again," he said grimly. "You can't shoot him. You know that." "But I can. They won't hang me for it. Even if they try, I'll have had the satisfaction of it." "You shouldn't be telling an inspector at Scotland Yard such things." "It doesn't matter. You want the bastard as much as I do. I heard the constable telling Greening that you'd shot at him yourself." Rutledge couldn't think of a suitable reply. Gilbert sipped his brandy for a time, and then he said, "I can talk about it now. I couldn't before. I thought it was the laudanum and nearly dying. Whatever. It left me confused, unable to be sure what was real and what was not. Do you know what it's like to doubt your own mind? To wonder if you've run mad? No, of course you don't. Not at your age. But I've sat here and pieced it together again. A bit at a time. It took me days. Weeks, for all I know." Rutledge waited. "He came through that window, Ian, bold as brass, and wished me a good evening. I had no idea who he was. He was dressed neatly, but in work clothes. I thought perhaps he was about to ask me for money. Instead, he asked if he might sit down. He'd come a long way, he said. I'll admit, I was intrigued. I wondered just what it was he wanted, and after a while he told me." There was a long silence. Once more Rutledge waited. The afternoon was far gone. There would be no sunset with the heavy clouds in the west. It would be dark soon. "He was Evan Dobson's son. I had no idea who Evan Dobson was and told him so. He seemed surprised, as if he expected me to remember. Then he explained that I'd been the Crown prosecutor in his father's trial. His father was convicted, he said, and on the 28th of June he was hanged. It had been scheduled at dawn, that hanging, but had been moved up to noon. His mother wasn't allowed to see him or even claim his body, and so she had sat in her cottage with her son by her side and watched the hands of the clock move inexorably to noon. She had cried out then like someone in torment. He hadn't understood why. He knew his father had been taken away and couldn't come back. That's all. When he was older, his mother told him why." Gilbert held out his glass, and Rutledge, without a word, got up and refilled it. He said he'd come to make me pay for what I'd done. I asked him if his father had been innocent, and that didn't seem to matter to him. It was the loss he had felt, and his mother's pain, and his father's inexplicable absence before he understood why this was so. Gilbert swirled the golden liquid in his glass and watched it catch the dying afternoon light. And then he asked where the kitchen was, that he'd come a long way and would like a glass of milk. I asked him if he were armed, and he said he wasn't. God help me, I told him where the kitchen was, and he left me sitting here and went out through the door there. Gilbert cleared his throat. He came back soon enough, a glass of milk in his hand. I asked him if he'd helped himself to the silver while he was about it, but he assured me he was an honest man and didn't intend to steal a penny. Nor did he, from what I learned later, Rutledge agreed. I didn't know that. At any rate, he set the glass of milk there on the desk and took a vial from his pocket. He began counting the drops as they went in. I thought he was intending to drink it, that he intended to kill himself in front of me and leave me to take the blame. For the first time I began to feel a rising alarm. But he didn't touch the milk. After he put the vial away, he said to me, in as quiet and sane a voice as my own, "You have a daughter, I think. How much do you love her?" When Gilbert didn't go on, Rutledge felt his stomach churn, unable to stop himself from imagining the horror that was to come. Gilbert drained his glass and put it aside. God forgive me. I told him that she was my only child, and of course I loved her. Enough to die for her. Would you willingly give your life for hers? And Rutledge remembered Mrs. Hadley's quiet, intense voice saying, "Ours was a love match. I'd have given my life for Jerry, and he for me." He made a bargain with me, Gilbert went on, fighting to keep his voice steady. If I would drink that glass of milk right now in front of him, he would swear on his mother's memory that he wouldn't touch my daughter. But if I refused, he would leave, and at a time of his own choosing, he wouldn't offer her a glass of laudanum. He would hang her, just as his father was hanged. And he reached under his coat and brought out a rope with a noose, which had been wrapped around his body. And he quietly recited her address and described her house to me so that I would know he'd been there and he would do what he said he would do. That obscene noose was in his hands, moving a little, swinging a little, and I believed him. So help me God, I believed him. His voice broke. It was several minutes before he could continue. I'm an old man. My mind isn't what it used to be. I told you that myself when you came asking questions about a trial I couldn't remember. I had to send you elsewhere to find the information you wanted. I asked him then what pleasure he got from threatening me if I didn't remember Evan Dobson. And he said it was no pleasure at all. But he and his mother had lived with loss and the torment of knowing that his father had been among strangers when the noose had been put around his neck and the hood dropped over his head. To spare the onlookers, he said. And so his father's last sight in this world were the men whose duty it was to take his life. Efficiently and coldly. There was no warmth or kindness or sorrow for his family. Even the priest brought for him hadn't cared because he never came to tell Dobson's mother that his father's last thought was for her. He could have, you know. That was the sad thing. Gilbert stared out into the growing darkness, then stirred as if coming back from a long way. And so his son was about to inflict the same pain on me. I would die facing someone who had no warmth or kindness or pity for me. My daughter would live with the grief of losing her father and wonder why I had chosen to take my own life without a word of explanation or farewell. It was rather diabolical. He didn't seem angry. I think I'd have been less shocked if he had been. I could have understood it. He just sat there waiting for me to make up my mind, that noose swinging before my eyes, and no mercy in his. And so in the end I couldn't take the chance. I couldn't put Claudia at risk. So I asked for the glass and I drank it down quickly, bitter as it was. He sat there watching me until I had passed out, in no hurry. I remember at one point reminding him that I had his word that Claudia wouldn't be harmed. And he simply smiled at me. I didn't know then whether he would keep his promise or not, if he would find pleasure in killing her too. By that time it was too late. I didn't hear him leave. My last thought was that if I'd refused, I'd have had time to warn her that I had failed her after all. It was terrifying to know that, as the darkness came down. I never expected to see the light again. Rutledge sat there stunned. Benjamin Clayton had had a daughter who had just left the house to stay the night with her brother and his wife. Joel Tattersall had a sister who was sleeping upstairs. Jerome Hadley had loved his wife deeply, and she was in Canterbury with friends. He didn't know how the headmaster Stoddard in Northumberland had felt about his wife. But there was the school he loved. And of course, Gilbert had had Claudia. Rutledge didn't know if Terence Chaston loved anyone. Would he drink a glass of laudanum to save his brother? Gilbert put his head back against the pillow behind it, spent and silent. Rutledge sat there with him, watching the night come down until it was dark enough to get up and light the lamp. He found himself thinking that if Dobson came again and Gilbert shot him, he himself would have no reservations about it. It would be justified, whatever the law felt about it. After a while he rose. "It's past time for your dinner. Let me fetch your housekeeper." "I'm not particularly hungry tonight." "You realize that I must go back to the yard and tell them what you've told me?" "If you do," Gilbert said, rousing himself, "I will deny it. Every word of it. Do you think I want Claudia to know this? That I didn't have the courage to protect her? Why do you think I've refused to speak all this time?" And there was Mrs. Hadley, who loved her husband deeply. She had spoken the words about dying for each other figuratively, as a measure of that love. How would she feel if she learned that he had quite literally died for her sake? "Then why have you told me? You know I represent the yard." "Because you need to hear what manner of monster you're dealing with. And if you are very smart, you'll see that he never hurts anyone else again. Do I make myself clear?" "I can't shoot him in cold blood, but you can keep the world from hearing what he did. Do you think Claudia and the others who survived his victims can bear to listen to what I've just told you? It's a final cruelty. He's better off dead, I tell you." "I understand what you're asking. I don't know if it's possible to keep it all out of the record. I give you my word I will try." He didn't offer to put Rutledge up that night. Gilbert bade him good night and went on sitting by the open window, waiting. Chapter 20. The rain came back, harder this time, as Rutledge drove through the gates of Swan Walk and made his decision. continue to London or go to Melinda Crawford's house. It was nearer. And he didn't think he could face Frances with Gilbert's voice still echoing in his ears. She would guess at once that something was wrong, and he couldn't tell her. When Melinda came down the lovely staircase to greet him, her hair in a long plait behind her back, the lace at the throat of her dressing gown gleaming brightly in the lamplight, she took one look at his face and said sharply, "Ian, what has happened?" "It's an inquiry. That's all. Has turned rather nasty." Relieved, she nodded. "I expect they sometimes do," she said, not pressing. "Are you hungry?" Over her shoulder, she said to Shanta, "Tea, please. In the sitting room." "I'd rather go up to bed. I'm not very good company." "You'll be the better for a little food and some tea. Go along in while I dress." "No, don't worry," he began, but she stopped him. "I'm going to dress. Go and sit down before you fall down." And so he walked on down the passage to her sitting room and sat there for a time, staring into the empty hearth. He could hear the fast patter of the rain on the terrace outside. It was soothing in its own way. It was then he remembered the letters he hadn't read. He took his friend Ross's out of his pocket, opened it, and scanned the brief message. "Ian, I've decided to do my bit. My father isn't best pleased, but I don't feel I can look myself in the shaving mirror if I don't. I've chosen the Navy. You know how I feel about the sea. I'll be back soon enough. Look after my father for me if anything happens. Not that I expect it will, but if it should, he will need you." It was signed simply Ross. He sat there staring at the familiar handwriting. He and Ross had always been as close as brothers. He couldn't even contemplate something happening to him. Folding the sheet and returning it to the envelope, he took out the second letter, the one from Terence Chaston. Only it wasn't from him. An unformed hand had written, "You have a sister. If you go on trying to find me, I will know, and you will put her at risk." His fatigue fell away. He was on his feet and heading for the door when Melinda came down the stairs again, impeccably dressed as always. At the same moment, Shanta came through the door from the kitchen stairs, a tray in her hands. He said, "I must go back to London. Now." "I won't hear of it," Melinda said, stepping between him and the door. "What's this all about?" "I can't tell you. It would take too long." "Nonsense! There is nothing in London that can't wait 10 minutes. She took his arm and drew him back toward the room he'd just left. "You will eat your sandwiches and drink your tea, and then you can go. Melinda, it will do you no good, nor London either, if you find yourself in a ditch. Have you noticed how the rain is coming down?" There was truth to that. The roads would be quagmires. He sat down at the tea table and Shanta put the plate of sandwiches in front of him and set the teapot, 2 cups, the cream jug and the sugar bowl in front of Melinda. She proceeded to pour the tea, and with a quick glance sent Shanta away. "Now then, what's happened?" "The man I've been searching for. He threatens Francis if I go on hunting him." "Do you believe him? Or is it an idle threat?" "I believe him. He had to. He'd sat there listening to Fillmore Gilbert's agony, and he'd believed every word." "Then you can stay the night here. Frances will be perfectly safe, and you won't frighten her to death rushing in to protect her." It made good sense. But he found it hard to think of food as he pictured her as she had been on the stairs earlier, her mind full of wool and what could be done with it to help the troops, alive with enthusiasm. Melinda handed him his cup of tea and added sugar to her own. Stirring vigorously, she said, "Now then, what's this about? Why can't you simply put in a call to the yard and ask them to safeguard her?" Rutledge tried to explain, to put into words how isolated he was. "It has to do with the murderer I've been searching for, the one I didn't know existed when I went to Moresby. The chief superintendent refuses to listen. He can't see that sometimes we have a feeling about a case, about a person, even about the evidence. I've learned to listen to those feelings. It would be useless to go to Bowles with this letter. He'd tell me to ignore it and get on with what needed to be done." "I'm not surprised that you do," she said. "You're your father's son. Those feelings were what made him such a good solicitor." "I expect you know probably more about this man than anyone other than Chief Inspector Cummins. More, possibly, than is safe for you to know." But not what Gilbert had told him as the sun had dropped down in the black shadows of the western sky. She said slowly, "I told no one about the letter you sent from Derbyshire. Mrs. Hadley was very grateful, you know." Ignoring his sandwiches and his tea, he went on as quietly. "The problem is, without the backing of the Yard, this threat to Francis can't be ignored. Cummins would do his best, but he would have to justify round-the-clock surveillance." She sat there trying to conceal her anger from him. Anger at his isolation and Bowles's stupidity. Rutledge reached into his pocket and took out the letter purportedly from Terence Chaston. As she looked at the envelope, he said, "Dobson's next victim is this man Chaston. What Dobson is telling me is not to interfere while he goes after him. I called on him in Torquay, and while I think Chaston believed me when I told him he could be in grave danger, he seemed to feel he could deal with this man Dobson himself." "And can he?" "I don't know. In his shoes, I wouldn't take the risk. Still, I'm too close to catching him. That's why Dobson wants me out of the way. Why he's threatening Francis." She opened the sheet of paper folded inside and read it. "Dear God, Ian," she said, looking quickly up at him. "Do you think Dobson has actually come to London?" "I don't know. I have to take it for granted that he can do what he says. I can't guard Francis all the time. I'm here in Kent, or Derby, or wherever I'm sent. The question is, how rational is this man? What if next month I'm sent to Torquay or Somerset or Bristol on another case entirely? Will he give me the benefit of the doubt? Or will he make good on his promise then? If I go after him, she's in danger. If I do nothing, he will be out there forever. And I won't know." He hesitated, not wanting to tell her why he was so afraid for Francis. But Melinda had been a soldier's daughter, a soldier's wife. She had been one of the child heroines of the great Indian Mutiny, the Sepoy Rebellion, carrying water to the wounded and to men fighting to save Lucknow from the mutineers bent on slaughtering the entire garrison. She had seen death in many guises. "What is it?" she asked, with that uncanny ability to read him. He was never sure why she could, whether it was love or only her deep knowledge of people. "What are you afraid to tell me?" He smiled wryly. "I didn't want to upset you. It's rather ugly." But in the end she made him tell her. After a long moment she said, "Of course you have to take this threat as real. The question is, what will you do about it? The best thing is to ask Chief Inspector Cummins to assign someone else to the case." "I don't think that will answer," she told him. "Will you tell your sister? You must, you know, if only to allow her to be watchful. It could make all the difference." Melinda Crawford was right, as she so often was. "I don't want to. I don't want to drag her into my wretched world of crime and murder and fear. In my view, Francis will deal with it better than you think. Be grateful this man doesn't know about Jean." Rutledge felt his heart lurch. "I was so worried about Francis I didn't consider—" "If he's found where I live, He could just as easily find Jean. He could have discovered your identity easily enough. He saw you in Penshurst Place and Swan Walk. A question casually asked in a pub one night about the man from London. It's not that far from the village to London. I'd have seen him. I'd have recognized him. Besides, I usually drive to the yard. But sometimes he didn't. Sometimes on a fine day he walked. Dobson needed only to wait at the yard to see where he went. And he needn't follow him all the way. He had already shown how easily he could discover a street and a number. It was an appalling thought. It made the danger to Francis even more frightening. You've got to find him, this man Dobson. But not tonight, my dear. He won't touch Francis lightly. She's his hold over you. He knows you'll protect her at any price. He wished he could believe her. He did, in his mind. He knew she was right. But he'd lost his parents and he couldn't lose Francis. Not to this man. Not after what Gilbert had told him. And now that made him afraid to lose someone he loved, just like the others. That letter was posted from Torquay, Rutledge said, willing himself to think clearly. It means he's there, looking for Chaston. I'll have to do something about that. But I shall have to see Francis safe first. I hesitate to ask, to put you at risk. But could I bring her here? By all means. But tell her as little as possible so as not to worry her. It's settled. Now go up to bed. A night's sleep won't make this go away. On the other hand, you'll be rested enough to plan properly. He finished the sandwiches if only to please her. Rising, he came around the table and took her hand. I'm glad you don't live in the north of England. My dear, it's much too cold in the north. She walked with him as far as the stairs. Watching him go up them, her mouth tightened. If she could have put her hands on this man Dobson just then, she knew she wouldn't be responsible for her actions. Back in London, Rutledge went first to the yard and spoke to Cummins. He said nothing to the chief inspector about the reasons Gilbert had willingly gone to his own death, but he did tell Cummins that the former Crown Prosecutor had confirmed that it was Dobson who had invaded his home and nearly killed him. Cummins said, Why did he change his mind and speak to you? I didn't expect it. Nor did I, Rutledge said. Sergeant Gibson needs to alert the police in Torquay. Dobson has a bicycle. I'll drive down straight away. I can recognize him. You haven't said. Why was there no struggle, no attempt to call for help? Was Dobson armed? In his mind's eye, Rutledge could see again the glint of the revolver beneath the shawls that wrapped Gilbert's thin shoulders and body. We weren't there. I expect we'll never know the pressure Dobson brought to bear. Cummins stared at him. It's the difference, he said after a moment, in whether it was suicide or murder, legally. We weren't there, Rutledge said again. We can't judge. And he was gone before Cummins could frame his next question. Francis was writing notes to contributors at the last fundraiser to thank them for their support. He waited until she had finished, sealed the envelopes and affixed stamps to them. Turning to her brother, she said lightly, If you had stood for Parliament instead of becoming a policeman, you could frank these for me. I'm spending a young fortune on stamps. Do MPs still have the right to sign a letter in lieu of stamping it? How do I know? But it seems like such a good idea, don't you think? She set the letters in a basket, ready to be posted, then said, You've been sitting there very patiently. Am I to hear the lecture again on bringing in someone to live here and protect my good name? It won't do, Ian. You're wasting your breath. No.
It's a case I've been working on. Somehow the man I believe to be a killer has found out where I live. I must leave for the south coast, and I would rather you went away for a few days, just as a precaution. Would you mind terribly?"
Francis regarded him. "Are you quite serious? Are you really in danger?"
"I doubt it. Still, my hands are tied. I can't be in two places at once. I'd be happier knowing you weren't here. Melinda is always asking you to spend a little time with her. Why not go there? The Yard is looking for this man. We'll have him in custody soon enough." It took a little persuasion, but in the end she agreed. He thought she might even have been glad of an excuse to be away from the talk of war, at least for a bit.
"If he's found this house, whoever he is, there's Jean to think of. You're there nearly as often as you are at home."
"Yes, I know," he replied, trying to keep the worry out of his voice. "I'll deal with that later. Go and pack what you need. Do you think Toby McBride would run you down to Kent?"
He was one of her numerous escorts, and at last word he hadn't rushed off to enlist.
And so it was arranged. An hour later, Toby was at the door, and it was time to carry Francis's luggage out to the motor car. Rutledge left instructions with the household, then went up to pack. He wanted to call on Jean. He'd missed her. He wanted very much to see her. It felt as if their entire engagement had been at the mercy of the Yard and, most especially, Dobson. But he knew it would possibly mean putting her at risk. And then he was on the road to Torquay. With him he carried the letter Dobson had written using Terence Chasten's name. He made the best time he could, driving through the night. As it was, he was already too late. Chapter 21. Although it was barely 7 in the morning, Rutledge went first to the house where Chasten lived. The housekeeper who opened the door told him that he was most likely at the shop at this hour. He drove on into the centre of the town. The bay was a sparkling silver under the early sun, but he had no time to notice it. A crowd had gathered in front of the baker's shop, and he saw a number of blue uniforms moving slowly down the service alley, engaged in an arm's-length search. Another constable was posted at the door of the bakery. It could mean only one thing. Dobson had got here first. Rutledge had to show his identification twice to get through the throng of people. The constables who passed him through were tight-lipped. The rear door was standing wide, and as he crossed the threshold he could hear voices from above. He took the steps 2 at a time and came out in the passage where Chasten had his office. The door to Chasten's office stood wide, and in the lamplight spilling out from it, he could see an overturned glass of milk, the contents spreading across the desk and pooling beneath an upended chair. A trail of trampled and torn papers led to another door that stood open. Here, stairs went up to the attic storeroom above. He started up them, dreading what he would find there, and was just in time to see 2 constables lowering a rope that had been flung over the rafters. A police inspector wheeled about as he heard Rutledge on the stairs. He wasn't the man Rutledge had worked with earlier. "Who are you, and who the hell let you through?" he snapped. "Scotland Yard. I have an interest in this matter." "Who found the victim?" "His brother. He's downstairs." He turned his back on Rutledge and watched as the constables finished with the rope, leaving it snaked across the attic floor. Nodding to one of the men, he said, "All right. Thank you. Go on down to the bakery and help with the statements." He turned to Rutledge, saying only, "Sefton." "Rutledge." Sefton gestured to the remaining constable, and he switched on a torch. In the dim light it had been hard to tell, but now Sefton pointed to one of the square oak girders that supported the rafters and the roof. The rope was tied off over there."
Someone else was coming up the stairs behind Rutledge. As the constable switched off the torch, he turned to see a slender man carrying a doctor's bag. He nodded to Rutledge as he came into the attic and stared at the rope on the floor.
"Where is he, then?"
"Downstairs."
"The constable said he was badly knocked about."
"Yes, you'll see for yourself." The doctor turned away, and Sefton, with a last look at the rope, its twisted thick knot and obscene lump on the floor, made to follow him.
"You'll want to look at Chaston as well,"
he said over his shoulder to Rutledge.
"You have an interest here, you say? What can you tell us about the man we're looking for?"
"His name is Dobson, Henry Dobson." Sefton's eyebrows went up.
"You seem damn sure of that. Is he likely to kill again? On my patch?"
"It's not likely. He was after Chaston." Sefton nodded and went on down the attic stairs. He turned to his right in the passage where the doctor was already heading for a second flight farther along that must, Rutledge thought, lead to the bakery itself.
"What's more, I'd like to hear how you arrived here in such a timely manner. Crystal ball gazing at the yard now, are you? A pity you weren't in time to warn Chaston."
Rutledge smiled dutifully. He could smell burning bread, heavy on the air. He said, "I wish we had a crystal ball. I'd spoken earlier to one of your colleagues, a man named Reed. He put a watch on Chaston's house for a week. Unfortunately, our quarry was recovering from an injury and we lost track of him. So apparently did Chaston. And the yard sent a telegram to him yesterday warning him that Dobson was likely to be here in Torquay. One also went to your station. John Reed has enlisted. So far I've only got through his current cases, not the backlog. As for any telegrams, only military traffic is getting through just now. There seems to be a 24 to 36-hour delay on anything else. You're telling me this killer lives in Torquay?" "Somerset, before he began killing people." He had Sefton's full attention now. "So you come from London to find out why Chaston wasn't already a victim?" He had stopped at the foot of the stairs, twisting his head to look up at Rutledge behind him.
"How many more victims were there?"
4. Another survived, barely. "I want to know more," Sefton said, his eyes unfriendly. "But it will have to wait until I've dealt with Chaston." He pushed open the door at the bottom of the stairs, and Rutledge found himself stepping into chaos, overlaid by heat, an even stronger smell of burning bread and heavy smoke from the ovens that irritated the eyes. The room was a shambles. Ingredients strewn everywhere, pots and pans scattered around the floor, and the long table that held the great bowls of rising dough lying on its side. Like the office, the kitchen had seen a vicious struggle. A man was sitting in a chair in the far corner of the room, his head in his hands. At the sound of the door opening, he lifted a battered, tear-streaked face as the policemen picked their way across the cluttered floor toward him. As his gaze shifted from Sefton to Rutledge, there was instant recognition in his eyes. Rutledge himself stopped short. "But this is Terence Chaston." "It is," Sefton replied over his shoulder. "The other one is in there, with the doctor." He gestured to a room just beyond where Chaston was sitting, then shouted to the constables in the front room of the bakery. "Someone get that damned bread out of the ovens!" "Gentle God," Rutledge said under his breath. He was still staring. It appeared that Chaston's nose was broken and one eye was fast swelling closed. His hands, dangling on his knees now, were bloody, skinned, the knuckles swelling. One ear was torn and bleeding onto his coat. The man didn't seem to notice. He knelt by the man's chair and said, "Tell me what happened." Sefton said brusquely, "There's no time for that. In here." Rutledge rose, put a hand on Chasten's shoulder, and followed the talky inspector into the next room, which had been an office and now was where employees kept their aprons and gear to clean the ovens and kitchen. The doctor was working over another man lying on the floor, a tablecloth spread across his body.
"Severe concussion, but he'll live," he said without stopping.
Rutledge moved around him to take a better look. The unconscious man was so like Chasten that it was a shock. The same red hair and freckles, although the last stood out like flecks of blood against his pale face.
"Fred Chasten, Terence's brother. Enough alike him to be his twin, but 2 years younger. Your man nearly hanged him."
"All right," Rutledge said, keeping his voice low. "It's my turn to ask the questions now. What happened? Do you have Dobson in custody?"
"I wish. The man who comes in at 4 was unwell, and Fred Chasten took his place this morning to start the ovens. Ready the first loaves of bread, the usual. He went upstairs for something, and there was your killer. I don't have all the story yet, but Fred fought him, lost, and was being dragged to the attic. Terence Chasten came in to find his office a wreck, and he went looking for his brother. He prevented the hanging, but their attacker got away down the kitchen stairs, and Terence went after him. You saw the state of the kitchen. But this man, your Dobson, ran for it when a passing constable heard the fight and stopped to investigate. He got out through the rear door and disappeared before the constable had a clear look at him. We've no idea what state he's in, but Chasten saved his brother's life."
"It was Chasten who put his brother at risk," Rutledge said shortly. "I warned him, and he felt he could defend himself. Dobson didn't realize they were so alike. Neither did I. In the dark, he must have seen Fred leaving the house and went after him, taking him for Terence." The doctor stood up.
"I think he's stable enough that he can be moved to the surgery now. I'll send someone for a stretcher. He'll need watching and a great deal of care. His brother got off lightly by comparison."
He went away to see to the stretcher. Standing there by the injured man, Rutledge gave Sefton a brief account of Dobson's past and his victims. "There's more, but it can wait." He left the inspector to watch over the bakery owner and went out to Terence Chasten again. The scorched pans and charred loaves were out of the ovens, and the overturned table had been righted. Someone had opened the door to the street to clear away the smoke. Standing by the chair this time, Rutledge said, "You didn't believe me. Your brother paid for it."
"I thought he was looking for me. I thought I could deal with him."
"It never occurred to you that Dobson might mistake Fred for you?"
"No. God, no."
"Do you make a habit of holding your brother in such low esteem? You've come here, nearly taken over his business, and then you leave him to the mercy of a killer. Did you even tell him about the danger you were in?" Chasten tried to shake his head and stopped when it hurt.
"He was after me, not Fred. I didn't think it was necessary."
Arrogance. Sheer, bloody arrogance.
"You're a fool, Chasten. You owe your brother more than you can repay." "But I saved his life."
"It was probably the other way around. Because he'd already fought Dobson to a standstill, you found it easier to save your brother," Rutledge said, not hiding the contempt in his voice. "I saw what Dobson did with a heavy hammer, smashing a large marble monument to dust. If Dobson had found you in that office alone, you'd have been no match for him. And an hour ago, Sefton would have been cutting you down from that rope."
"Dear God."
Chasten looked away then. After a moment, he said in a much more subdued voice, "Still, I must tell you, it was your warning that saved both of us. It gave me the advantage. I knew who that man must be.
I knew why he was here. Before he could recover from the shock of seeing two of us wondering which one he was about to hang, I hit him. That's when he dropped the rope and came after me. Count yourself lucky, then. Rutledge turned away as the doctor returned with the stretcher and 2 constables. Chaston got to his feet and stumbled after them into the small room where his brother lay. Sefton came out, leaving the others to it. I must telephone the yard directly. Where will I find a telephone I can use at this hour? Sefton gave him directions, adding, I'll see you at the police station when I've finished here. By late afternoon, Rutledge was free to find a room in one of the hotels and threw himself down across the bed in exhaustion. He didn't sleep without dreams. Dobson was there, always just out of sight around a corner, or walking out of a room filled with people while he dodged this way and that, trying to follow. On Rutledge's orders, Tunbridge in Kent sent men to the farm where Dobson recovered from his gunshot wound, but he failed to return there. Half of England was on alert. Day after day, reports poured into the yard, mostly false alarms. The manhunt went on. A guard was placed on Gilbert's house once more, and Chaston's, but there was still no sign of the man. He appeared to have vanished once more. And Frances Rutledge stayed in Kent longer than she'd expected. Meanwhile, the war news grew uglier with every passing day. The BEF had fallen back to Ypres, but they were still blocking the coast road. There was a ridge above the town, Passchendaele. No one quite knew how to pronounce it or to spell it, until men began dying there. Rutledge was preparing to leave for Moresby when a Captain Devereux from a Wiltshire regiment came in one afternoon. Bowles ordered everyone to listen to what the officer had to say. He was eloquent as he described the need for men who had experience in the police to train as officers. Bowles looked around at his men and asked, "Right then, who's for it?" His gaze rested on Rutledge for an instant longer than necessary, and then moved on. Afterward, when the men had been dismissed, Devereux followed Rutledge into his office and sat down without waiting for an invitation. "A hard business, convincing men to serve when the news from France is so bleak. The hotheads have already come forward. Finding others is another matter." He paused. "A Major Gordon suggested you. Ideal officer material, he said. A natural leader. Any interest in soldiering, Inspector?" "There's a case coming to trial in Moresby. I have to be there to give evidence." "It's wartime. Surely a statement would do." "Not in this instance. This man isn't guilty. I know it. I've had the devil of a time proving it, and if I'm not there, he could very well hang for a murder he didn't commit." "He's one man. Hundreds are dying in France." "If he were your brother, would you feel that same way?" Devereux countered. "Is he your brother?" "He's my responsibility." Devereux got to his feet. "Shall I tell Major Gordon that you'll think our offer over?" "I don't make promises I can't keep." The captain nodded. "I understand. Good luck in Moresby." "I can honestly say that I hope your man doesn't hang." He walked out, shutting the door behind him. Rutledge stared after him for a long time, then turned his attention to his preparations for Moresby. They had never really made peace with each other over Dobson, he and Bowles. Sefton and the Torquay police had done everything in their power to find the man, even walking into darkened cinemas and crowded concerts. They kept a watch on the boats in Tor Bay. They took a dozen men into custody, only to be told by Chaston, rushed to the station each time to look at them, that they'd picked up the wrong person. Bowles had quietly closed these still open inquiries. The blackened graves,
the murders of Stoddard, Tattersall and Hadley. He'd closed as well the attempted murder of Fillmore Gilbert. But he'd stubbornly drawn the line at Kingston. When he reached the seaside town with its magnificent ruins high above on the cliff, Rutledge saw that the pleasure boats had vanished and the fishing fleet was tied up in the harbour. War had come here, too.
This is the end of the disc. The audiobook continues on the next disc.
The trial was to be held in the tiny courthouse. The afternoon before it was to open, Rutledge walked up to the headland and spent an hour in the Abbey ruins. He hadn't seen Inspector Faraday. He hadn't expected that he would. In the morning, quite early, he'd dressed, then eaten his breakfast in the hotel dining room before walking up to the courthouse. There was a throng of people waiting to find seats. He moved through them to the doors and gave his name. Passed through to where witnesses waited, he found himself face to face with Mrs. Kingston, her expression smug. She recognized him, but he said nothing to her. He was waiting for Fred Chaston to appear. He hadn't been at the hotel last night, and Rutledge wasn't certain that he would keep his promise to come. At the last minute, he walked in, his face pale, the freckles standing out starkly. The bruises had faded. "I didn't want to come," he said quietly to Rutledge. "I don't want to relive what happened. If it weren't for the need to keep the bakery going, I think I'd have gone mad. But Terence told me it was my duty. He drove me here himself." "It was good of you to do this," Rutledge said, and he meant it. As it was, they spent the day waiting for the summons that never came. The prosecution was presenting its case, and Mrs. Kingston was one of the earliest to be called. Her husband, Tad, came in after she had gone. He saw Rutledge and walked over to sit down beside him.
"I couldn't stop her," he said. "But once this is over, I won't live with her any longer. I told the lawyers that I wouldn't sit in the same room with her. I've been cooling my heels in a back corridor."
He twisted his hat around and around in his hands.
"You believed in Mark. I know that. But public opinion has been against him. Benjamin Clayton and his family are well liked. If I hadn't taken my cousin to his father that day, he wouldn't have seen him at all."
Was he forgiven? Rutledge asked, finding he really wanted to know.
"He was. It was too late to change the will, but Mark told his father he'd begun a new life in Scarborough and didn't think he'd make a good farmer. If this is finished, I'll go with him myself to speak to his former employer, Hartle."
Good man. It wasn't until mid-morning of the next day that the defence was given its turn. Tad Kingston was called first, and soon after that Rutledge took the witness box. Kingston looked haggard. He stood in the dock stoically, his gaze fixed straight ahead. Rutledge wondered if he had taken in any of the proceedings. He gave his evidence clearly and objectively, explaining why he had gone to Bristol and why it had taken so very long to find out the truth about Henry Dobson.
"Where is Dobson now?"
he was asked. "I wish I knew. He has much to answer for."
"And you are convinced that Benjamin Clayton was on his list of victims?"
"You have been given a list of the jurors in that particular trial. Clayton's name is there." He went on, outlining the similarities in the deaths of the other victims. "It's difficult for me to believe as a police officer that Benjamin Clayton could have been killed by anyone else. If Mr. Kingston had broken into that house to steal money, he would have killed Clayton quickly and got himself out of there. And where did the rope come from in the first place? Hardly the tool of someone breaking and entering." The prosecution tried to trip him up, but Rutledge was prepared for that, and stated flatly that he'd warned Inspector Faraday that the inquiry was ongoing and that it would be premature to make an arrest at that early stage. The neighbour who had met Dobson on the street gave her evidence in a quiet and steady voice. "I didn't know," she said. "I didn't know who he was or why he was asking questions. I thought he was a nice young man." She was asked if she had ever seen the defendant on the street where Clayton lived. She shook her head. "I'm afraid not." It was Fred Chasten's evidence that stunned the court. He gave it in the husky voice of a man struggling not to let the memory overwhelm him. "Dobson meant what he said. His threat wasn't an idle one, as I know to my cost." When the courtroom had quieted down, Rutledge slipped out. He had no doubt of the verdict now. And he was right. The jury debated for fewer than 2 hours before finding Kingston not guilty of the murder of Benjamin Clayton. It was Michael Clayton who came to speak to him on the street as Rutledge was putting his valise into the motor car. "I'll find him," he said earnestly, "if it takes the rest of my life." "And then what? Will you hang for his murder?" "I'll drag him to the nearest police station so that he can hang like his father before him." Rutledge didn't see Fred Chasten again. He stopped for the night in York and spent most of it standing at the only window looking down on the silent city, the Monk Bar gate looming dark and massive just outside. When he slept, it was peacefully for the first time in weeks. There were 3 other people now who could identify Dobson when he was found: Gilbert and the Chasten brothers. The sketch that appeared in the newspapers across England wasn't a good likeness in Rutledge's opinion, and so far hadn't produced any trustworthy sightings. There wouldn't be another chance to find him. Dobson had done what he had set out to do, and while Gilbert and the Chastens were still alive, he seemed to feel no pressing need to finish what he'd started. And he was a master at disappearing, as he'd shown so many times before. It was possible the police would never find him. But he would stay on the list of wanted men. Even Bowles couldn't prevent that. Rutledge slept in his own bed that night. And the next morning he went to the yard, set all his files in order, finished his report on the Clayton trial, and then wrote to Mrs. Hadley, Miss Tattersall, and the vicars in the villages of Netherby and Beecham. He had promised them answers, but he hadn't taken anyone into custody. Still, he could set their minds at ease by telling them who had been behind these murders and the vandalism that preceded it. That done, he shut his door behind him and walked down the passage to Cummins's office. He wasn't at his desk, and Rutledge asked Sergeant Gibson if Cummins was expected back soon.
"Sorry, sir. I believe he's in meetings for the rest of the day. Is it anything urgent, sir?"
"Urgent? No, I'll leave him a note, I think." He went back upstairs into Cummins's office, and after shutting the door, he sat down at the desk, found a sheet of paper and an envelope, only to sit there staring at nothing, the pen drying in his hand. And then he began to write. Without rereading it, he folded the sheet, put it in the envelope, and wrote Cummins's name on the front before sealing it. He left it in the corner of the blotter where it would be noticed as soon as Cummins walked through the door. He had left his motor car close by St. Margaret's Church. Just as he reached it, he saw Kate coming toward him from the direction of Westminster Abbey. She was dressed in black, and he realized that she must have just come from a memorial service for someone. There were more and more of those for the war dead buried in France. She smiled and waved, hurrying to catch him up before he could turn the crank. "You're not leaving London again, are you?" she called. "You've just come back." "Not at the moment," he said. "Later, perhaps." Something in his face must have given him away. Rutledge saw that at once and cursed himself for waiting for her. She didn't need to say goodbye so soon to another friend on his way to the front. Then he realized that it went deeper than friendship. "Ian," she said, stricken, "please tell me Jean hasn't convinced you to do something rash. Have you seen the casualty lists in the newspapers? It's been dreadful, all that killing. I don't think I could bear it if—"
She broke off before she could say something she would forever regret. Turning away, she stared in the direction of the river, struggling to recover her self-possession. They could hear the river traffic from where they stood, and feel the cold wind off the water. Neither one of them spoke. Rutledge wanted to comfort her, but he knew he couldn't. Shouldn't. To try would only embarrass her more. After a moment, she looked up at him, shielding her eyes with her hand, searching his face. And then she said, as if it was what she'd intended all along, "I couldn't bear it if I had to break dreadful news to Jean." "It will be all right," he responded, and reached out to touch her shoulder, a comradely gesture. After a moment, she added brightly, "I'm sure it will be. I'm sure you'll come home safely to Jean and to Francis." She stood on tiptoe then and kissed his cheek. "Godspeed." And then she was hurrying back the way she'd come, and he saw that several other young women dressed in black, one of them heavily veiled, were just coming out of the Abbey. Kate slowed her pace before reaching them, and he thought she must be giving herself time to recover. He'd always been fond of Kate. He'd always enjoyed her company. He had never meant to hurt her. Cranking the motor car, he got in and drove away. It had been a sobering encounter. For an instant, waiting for Kate to come up to him, he'd had a fleeting glimpse of Jean in mourning. It had reinforced his resolve to ask her to wait until he came home again to marry him. His first stop was the house his parents had left to his sister. Francis was out, busy with the charities and fundraisers that had begun to transform the London social scene. There was a message on the table in the hall. She was at a meeting of her knitting committee and would return well before dinner. He was about to break his promise to her. He wanted a chance to explain. But perhaps it was better. Perhaps it would be easier this way. Rutledge left the house and went to find Captain Devereux. An hour later, he went to tell Jean what he'd done. She threw her arms around him and held him close for a moment. "An officer! Ian, I'm so proud of you. I can't wait to tell Mamma, to write to Papa. And at Christmas, when we're married, we'll have sabres after all." Jean laughed, looking up at him. "You don't know how much I love you." It could wait until tomorrow, he thought, asking her to put off the wedding for a bit. She might even suggest it herself. Her father was a soldier. She would know the risks without being told and understand that it wasn't death he feared. It was returning to England, to her, less a man, maimed and ugly in her eyes. He was standing there, his arms around her, watching her face, watching happiness brightening her eyes and bringing a flush to her cheeks, when he remembered something Captain Devereux had said. "War is a bloody business, Rutledge. But you already know something about that. You'll hold steady when the time comes." He learned later that Captain Devereux had never been to France. And the man was wrong. Dealing with murder victims, bad as it was, didn't hold a candle to war. Chapter 22. Boxing Day, December 26, 1914. Heavy grey clouds hung over London, promising more rain, and the Thames was an ugly pewter ribbon running through the city. Even the streets gleaming in the uncertain morning light were dreary, and passers-by hurried about their business with heads down, as if burdened by their own thoughts. At Victoria Station, the steam from the locomotive festooned the damp air with nowhere to go because there was no breeze to move it along. The platform was crowded with families there to say goodbye to loved ones in uniform.
trying to find the right words for men bound for Dover and Folkestone, and the transports for France. Fighting had been heavy throughout the autumn, and casualty lists in the newspapers made sombre reading. The martial euphoria of August, when the war had begun, promising to be an easy victory, hadn't survived for very long. The rush to enlist hadn't become conscription. Like so many others, Rutledge had been glad he hadn't waited, that he had made his own decision to go. Training was finished. He was a newly minted lieutenant with a company waiting for him in France. Highlanders, he'd been told. Good fighting men, so good it was said that Germans feared them. They went into battle in their regimental kilts, pipes skirling. He'd wondered what such men would make of an English officer. At least he'd spent some time in the Highlands, including summers with David Trevor and his son Ross. He could understand the people who lived in such places. Now, as they made their way toward the carriages, Jean held tightly to Rutledge's hand. He could see that she was fighting back tears. "Don't cry," he said bracingly, smiling down at her, trying to sound reassuring. "You promised you wouldn't. I'll be home before you know it. This can't last much longer." But he knew it could now, and very likely would. The war was fast becoming a stalemate as each side dug in, unable to move forward, refusing to retreat. The lists of dead, wounded, and missing had cast a pall over the holidays, and here in the last few days of the old year, men heading for the front were no longer expecting to cover themselves with glory, and in a matter of weeks, march back into London to the cheers of a grateful nation. He'd said goodbye to Francis and to Melinda Crawford at the house. They had discussed it and decided it was best that way. Melinda had told him how handsome he looked, and Francis had made him promise to come home safely. He'd read the worry in their eyes even as they tried to hide it. Jean had been waiting for him outside the station when he got there. Rutledge led her to a sheltered spot by the canteen door, his arm and his rank protecting her as the crowd grew larger the closer it came for time to board. A company of Scots marched by, kilts swinging, and boarded the train. He knew they were new recruits. Their faces were apprehensive, not haunted. "I'll miss you," he said quietly. "Don't worry if you don't hear from me straight away or as often as you'd like. The post is regulated. Censors, that sort of thing. It will mean delays. But I promise you I will write. Remember that." She lifted her head and clutched at him, the finality of enlisting coming home to her at last. "I wish you hadn't volunteered. You needn't have. You were needed at Scotland Yard." "You thought it was a splendid idea at the time," he reminded her, only half teasing. "Yes, everyone was volunteering. It was exciting, exhilarating. The flags, the music, all the uniforms. I thought it would all be over before you saw any fighting. I thought it was all a lark. And now it's real." She began to cry. "You must come back to me, Ian. You must promise. I can't imagine life without you." "Jean, my dear." It was he who had insisted that they postpone their Christmas wedding. He knew how much it had hurt her, but he'd seen the wounded coming back to England. He'd visited 2 hospitals where friends had been taken, and it was a sobering sight. He'd tried to explain, and she hadn't understood that he couldn't tie her to the wreckage he might so easily become. She had wanted to be his wife, and he was grateful, more grateful than he could say. But he also wanted her to have a choice. And if they were already married, that choice would be taken from her. He thought he could stand anything but pity. She deserved so much more. A whistle blew, signalling that the remaining troops should board. Rutledge took Jean's hands. "My love." He kissed her fingers and then her cheek. And suddenly she was in his arms. He wasn't quite sure how it had happened, and all the pent-up longing and loss swept him. And that kiss was very different. Afterward, holding her at arm's length, he said huskily, "Goodbye." And before she could say anything or knew what he was about, he turned and walked swiftly toward the train without looking back. He told himself that it was best for both of them. The landing in Calais went smoothly despite what appeared to be chaos in every direction, made worse by patches of mist that clung here and opened there, a hazard to men and machines as well as the horses. Troops and stores were being offloaded, wounded waiting to be carried on board, vehicles of every description clogging the streets near the port, refugees trying to find lodgings. It had been a rough crossing, many of the men seasick, including a few of the Scots who'd never been aboard a ship before. He'd spent part of the voyage standing at the railing of the ship, watching England recede into the storm clouds obscuring the white cliffs. One of the Highlanders, a man nearly as tall as he was, had come to stand near him. They didn't speak. Not until France loomed ahead, a blur of coastline. There had been a spot of trouble below, but neither of them referred to it now. Above the sound of the sea they could hear the guns, artillery. He couldn't be sure whether it was British fire or German. The Scot glanced at him. "Our turn, soon enough. Good luck to ye, sir." "The same to you, Private MacLeod." He'd just come down the gangway and was searching for his transport when he saw the man. He was being helped out of an ambulance and onto a stretcher. He had a heavily bandaged foot and wasn't able to walk. Rutledge recognized him straight away. Dobson must have felt his gaze, for he turned his head, and their eyes met. The man on the stretcher scowled but said nothing. Just as Rutledge was turning away, a shot rang out, startlingly loud even in the chaos of the port, echoing against the cliffs above and sending the gulls into swirling flight. Rutledge whirled in time to see Dobson jerk, then fall back on the stretcher. Soldiers were already hurrying to search the quay for whoever had fired the shot. In the mists, he could be anywhere. Orderlies were still working feverishly over Dobson, but it was too late. There was nothing they could do for him. Even as Rutledge walked on, he saw one of them shake his head, then reach for the edge of a blanket, drawing it over Dobson's face. Rutledge didn't stop. He was no longer an inspector at Scotland Yard. He was a lieutenant in the British Army. Cummins would see Dobson's name in the listings of dead and wounded and know it was finished. He had searched the list since Dobson had disappeared the last time without much hope of ever finding his name there. He was just stepping into his transport when something made him turn and look back. Michael Clayton, in the uniform of a medical orderly, was leaning against the side of a shed that had once been used by French customs and was now a staging area for the wounded. At his feet was a jumble of kits waiting to be taken down to the quays and loaded aboard. Not 2 yards from him was a soldier slumped against the same wall, head to one side in an exhausted sleep. His rifle lay across his knees. It was a little backwater, no one else around, but it had an excellent view down to where a cluster of men stood looking at the crumpled body lying at their feet. How had he known? Then Rutledge realized that Clayton must have been among the orderlies who had just helped unload the train of wounded. There would have been a tag around the neck of every man with his name, his rank, his regiment, and his wound. Easy enough to read. A word, a whispered question, and Clayton would have seen the reaction. Would have known he had the right man. Scotland Yard had no authority here. Rutledge got into the lorry, greeted his driver, and they began the long journey to the north and the waiting war. This is Stephen Crossley. We hope you have enjoyed this unabridged production of A Fine Summer's Day. An Inspector Rutledge Mystery by Charles Todd. This program was produced by John Marshall Media. Executive producer, Caitlin Gehring. Text copyright 2015 by Charles Todd. Production copyright 2015 by HarperCollins Publishers. All rights reserved. Thank you for listening.